They didn't whisper it. They didn't hide it behind champagne smiles or fake hugs. No, my parents stood there in front of 200 guests, looked me dead in the eyes and called me a barn wife. My mother scoffed like she tasted something rotten. My father chuckled. My sister smirked, veil glowing in the sunset like a crown. And I stood near the back row in a dress I paid for myself, trying not to shake. I swallowed the shame like poison, thick, burning, unforgettable. They didn't just insult my marriage. They spat on everything I'd built, every quiet morning on the farm, every night I spent holding on to love instead of money. They thought they'd won, that I'd come crawling back to beg for approval, that I'd disappear unnoticed, unimportant. But then, the ground started to tremble. People looked up. The sky growled. And in that moment, my moment, a helicopter descended from above, kicking dust onto their perfect white tablecloths. They mocked my husband until he stepped out of that chopper and made them regret every word they ever said. So stay with me, because if you've ever been humiliated, disowned, or made to feel small, this story is for you. And trust me, by the end, you won't just be cheering. You'll be ready to rise too. Ella Callahan was 32 years old, a respected interior designer in New York City. Her name carried weight among developers and clients who wanted elegance stamped onto glass towers and penthouse suites. She had money in the bank, a name in society columns, and the kind of career her family liked to boast about at dinner parties. Yet as she stood in the center of her latest project, a glittering penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, she felt the same emptiness she had carried for years. The marble gleamed. The lighting was flawless, every piece of furniture imported and arranged at just the right angle. The client was ecstatic, already sending word to friends that Ella was a genius. But when the workers left and the champagne glasses were cleared away, she lingered in the silent apartment, staring at her reflection in the glass. There she was, in a sleek black dress, hair perfectly styled, makeup that said success. But the woman in the reflection looked hollow. The room around her felt like a museum, polished but lifeless. Ella pressed a hand against the cool glass and whispered to herself, almost afraid of the sound of her own voice. Is this really me? Her family would have said yes. This was her. This was the life she was supposed to live. The Callahans had always moved in the right circles, played tennis at the right clubs, hosted parties with the right people. Her parents prided themselves on discipline and image. For them, success was measured in status, in which names appeared on your guest list, and which pedigrees married into your bloodline. They reminded her of this every holiday, every dinner where conversation turned from politics to business to marriage. For years, Ella had absorbed their lessons, smiling politely as her mother dropped hints about investment bankers, and her father compared Ivy League degrees as though they were horse pedigrees. She dated men who fit the mold, lawyers in tailored suits, venture capitalists with sleek cars, men who knew exactly which wine to order without looking at the menu. They looked perfect on paper, but in person, they were cold, rehearsed, often more interested in her family name than in her. She remembered more than one evening when she sat across from such a man in an expensive restaurant, nodding at his stories while she felt herself vanish behind the mask she had been taught to wear. Her parents saw those matches as victories. They called them connections, as though Ella herself were simply a piece on their chessboard. But inside she wrestled with a silence that deepened each year. She told herself she was fortunate that many women would trade places with her without hesitation. Still, when she returned home at night to her meticulously decorated apartment, she would sink into the sofa and stare at the ceiling, feeling nothing but exhaustion. One evening, after the penthouse unveiling, Ella found herself at her vanity staring at her own face in the mirror. The gold light framed her cheekbones, the designer dress draped perfectly over her shoulders, yet she felt the ache of something missing. She thought about the penthouse again, the way the walls echoed when no one spoke inside it, the way it felt more like a display than a home. She realized that her own life was much the same, a carefully staged performance. Her mother had once told her, a woman's success is measured by the man she marries. Her father often added, we raised you to marry up, not down. Ella carried those words like stones in her pockets. She never dared argue openly, the one time she hinted at wanting to study art rather than business. Her father dismissed it as a hobby, not a career. Later, when she considered traveling after college, her mother reminded her that time was better spent building connections, not chasing dreams. Piece by piece, Ella had folded herself into the shape her parents demanded, until she no longer recognized the outline. Now, at 32, with her name etched on prestigious projects, she felt the weight of that shape more than ever. Clients congratulated her friends, envied her, but late at night, she asked herself if any of it mattered. Would she ever know what it meant to build something real, something that was hers alone? The question gnawed at her, and the reflection in the mirror gave no answer. She thought of her family's expectations once more. Her sister Sophie, radiant and spoiled, had always been the favorite. Sophie was the one her parents paraded at events, the one who could do no wrong. Ella had accepted that role, quietly becoming the dependable older daughter who never caused trouble. Yet deep down, resentment simmered. She had watched Sophie glide effortlessly through life while Ella carried the responsibility of appearances. Every time her parents praised Sophie's charm, Ella felt herself shrinking further into invisibility. That night, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, the city spread beneath her like a field of stars. She wondered what it would feel like to live without the weight of family expectations, to step off the path carved for her. She wondered if love could exist outside of pedigrees and contracts. She wondered if she would ever be seen for who she truly was rather than what she represented. The emptiness pressed heavier on her chest. Ella knew something had to change, though she had no idea how. She only knew that the life she had built, glamorous on the outside, hollow within, could not sustain her forever. And then, as if fate had heard her quiet plea, an invitation came across her desk. Not to another gala or design showcase, not to another evening of polite conversation and champagne. It was for a modest agricultural fair upstate where one of her clients was launching a new line of organic products. She almost declined thinking it beneath her usual assignments, but something made her pause. She remembered the taste of fresh fruit from childhood summers, the simplicity of dirt under her nails, when she was allowed to play in the garden before her parents pulled her inside. A whisper inside her urged her to go. She didn't know it yet, but at that fair, among the stalls of produce and the scent of fresh earth, a stranger would step into her path, a man whose presence would shake everything she thought she knew about success, family, and love. The invitation to the agricultural fair in Hudson Valley seemed at first like a small assignment, a break from the gleaming towers and penthouses that usually filled Ella's calendar. She almost turned it down, thinking it trivial compared to her usual clientele, but something compelled her to accept. Perhaps it was the restlessness that had been gnawing at her, or the faint nostalgia for summers, when she had felt soil beneath her fingers before her parents pulled her back inside to preserve her hands for piano lessons. Whatever the reason, on a crisp Saturday morning, she found herself driving north away from Manhattan's glass skyline and into the wide stretch of countryside where fields rolled out under the autumn sun and the air tasted of apples and earth. The fair bustled with families, farmers, and vendors selling everything from handmade cheese to jars of honey. It was noisy, unpolished, even a little chaotic, but Ella felt something loosen in her chest as she walked through the stalls. She was there in a professional capacity, overseeing the design of a booth for a new organic brand launching its line of preserves and juices. She checked the angles of the wooden displays, adjusted the placement of fruit baskets, and gave quiet instructions to her assistant. Her sharp eye for aesthetics contrasted with the rough wood and burlap, yet somehow it all came together. The booth drew attention not because it was flashy, but because it felt honest. That was when she noticed him. A tall man in a faded flannel shirt, jeans, worn pale at the knees, and boots that had seen more mud than pavement. He was helping an elderly vendor set up a table of pumpkins, lifting the crates as though they weighed nothing. His movements were steady, without hurry, and his voice carried warmth when he reassured the vendor that everything looked perfect. When he turned, she caught a glimpse of his face, sun-browned skin, clear eyes that held no artifice. He noticed her watching and offered a polite nod before returning to his task. Later, when the crowd thinned, he approached her booth looking curiously at the design. "You did this?" he asked, his voice low, steady, with a hint of the land in it. Ella, slightly startled, nodded. "Yes, I was hired to make it inviting." "Well," he said, glancing at the neat rows of preserves and the way the wood framed the products, "it looks honest." "That's rare." She laughed softly. "Honest design. I'll take that as a compliment." He extended a hand, rough from work but steady. "Luke Reynolds. I run a farm a few towns over. Mostly grains and cattle." She shook his hand, surprised by the firmness and the directness of his gaze. "Ella Callahan, designer." For a moment they simply looked at each other, two people from different worlds standing among jars of apple butter. Then Luke gestured toward the booths. "I almost took a job in the city once. A big firm wanted me on their management track. I lasted a week before I knew I couldn't do it. Sitting under fluorescent lights, staring at screens, talking about profits instead of seasons, it felt like I was withering. So I went back home. People thought I was crazy, but the farm, it's my family's blood. I couldn't let it go." Ella listened, something tightening in her chest. His words were simple, but there was no apology in them. He spoke as if the soil itself had given him direction. In her world, men measured themselves by titles and bonuses. Luke measured himself by crops that grew and cattle that thrived. His honesty was disarming. She found herself asking questions she didn't normally care to ask. "Isn't it hard farming, I mean? With the weather, the markets?" Luke smiled, slightly, lines crinkling at the corners of his eyes. "Hard every day. But I wake up knowing what I'm working for. Land doesn't lie to you. It gives back what you put in eventually. The city, it takes, and it never feels like enough." His words echoed inside her, unsettling the walls she had built. She thought of the penthouse she had finished, gleaming and soulless, and wondered if maybe she had been chasing something hollow all along. For the first time in years, she felt a spark, not admiration for a client's wealth, not relief at a job well executed, but curiosity about a man who seemed utterly content with who he was. They walked together through the fair, talking about simple things, the price of grain, the unpredictability of seasons, her work with design. Ella admitted she often felt her projects were beautiful but lifeless shells for people who wanted to display status rather than create homes. Luke listened intently, never mocking, never interrupting, as though her frustrations mattered. He spoke of his own dreams, expanding his farm to try sustainable methods, passing something stronger down to the next generation. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the fair began to quiet, Ella realized she had spent hours in his company without the usual armor she wore around men. She hadn't thought once about pedigrees, about how he would look in society pages, about whether her parents would approve. She thought only of the steadiness in his voice, the way he seemed rooted to something real. When they parted, Luke touched his hat in a gesture so simple and old-fashioned it made her smile. "Maybe I'll see you again," he said. She nodded, though her heart was racing with questions she didn't dare speak. That night, driving back to Manhattan, the city lights seemed harsher, colder. She replayed his words about the land not lying, about working for something that mattered. For the first time, the image of her family's perfect suitors felt shallow, brittle, compared to the strength of a man who chose soil over skyscrapers. Ella didn't know it yet, but this meeting was the beginning of everything. What she couldn't have guessed was that Luke carried a secret of his own, one that would change how she saw him and herself forever. Ella could not shake the memory of that afternoon in Hudson Valley. The fair was long over, the booths dismantled, the laughter and music faded into memory, but Luke's voice lingered with her like the aftertaste of something both foreign and strangely familiar. She returned to New York and slid back into her life of deadlines, fabric swatches, and clients who measured success in square footage and imported marble. Yet in quiet moments, she caught herself smiling at the thought of a man who had soil under his nails and spoke about the land as though it were alive. It began with phone calls. At first, short, polite exchanges to thank him for walking her around the fair, then longer conversations that stretched into midnight. Luke spoke with ease about the rhythms of his days, the unpredictability of weather, the satisfaction of seeing fields ripen under his care. He listened when she confessed her doubts about her work, when she admitted she often felt more like a performer than a creator. His silence never felt dismissive. It felt like space where she could breathe. Soon weekends became their secret time. She found reasons to travel upstate visiting a client overseeing a site. In truth, she was slipping into Luke's truck, riding out to the fields where the horizon seemed to open wider than she had ever seen. They kept it hidden not out of shame, but necessity. Ella knew the circles she moved in. Her family's friends were quick with whispers, her parents quicker with judgment. Luke belonged to no club, held no title, and drove no luxury car. He was the sort of man her parents would dismiss with a glance. So she met him in quiet places, a diner off the highway, where no one from the city would wander back roads lined with maples blazing red in the fall. In those moments, she felt more alive than she had in years. Still, secrets have a way of slipping out. It was Sophie, her sister, who first noticed Ella's absences. She made a joke at dinner asking if Ella's mystery farmer was keeping her busy. Their mother's fork clinked against the china, her father's eyes narrowing. Ella tried to laugh it off, but the question hung in the air like smoke. Within days, her parents demanded answers. The confrontation came in their penthouse beneath the weight of chandeliers and family portraits. Her father's voice was sharp, slicing through the air. A farmer. Ella, after everything we invested in you, after the schools, the introductions, the sacrifices, this is what you bring home. Her mother's tone was colder still. Do you understand what people will say? Do you understand what this does to our name? Sophie Ever, the favored one, sat smirking, adding small cuts disguised as concern. He's beneath you, Ella. Everyone knows it. Their words struck harder than she expected. She had known they would disapprove, but the venom in their voices stunned her. They spoke of Luke as though he were dirt unworthy of even being considered. They reminded her of every gala she had attended, every man they had once praised as suitable. They wielded status like a weapon, and for the first time, Ella felt the full weight of what it meant to defy them. That night, lying awake in her own apartment, she replayed every word. Was love measured by income, by lineage, by the right friends in the right rooms? Or was it measured by the steadiness of a man who woke before dawn to tend his fields, who looked her in the eye and saw her as she was not, as a pawn in a family game? She remembered the penthouse she had designed, flawless and hollow. She remembered the way Luke had spoken about soil, about truth that could not be bought or faked. The question tormented her. Could she bear the cost of choosing him? Could she live with herself if she did not? Ella had spent her life meeting expectations, folding herself into the shape her family demanded. But with Luke, for the first time, she felt like she was unfolding, becoming whole. Her parents thought they had cornered her, forced her to see reason. Instead, their cruelty ignited something fierce inside her. She was tired of masks, tired of bending. And though fear clawed at her, she knew what she had to do. Ella was about to make a choice that would sever her from the only world she had ever known. A choice that would silence the dinners, the invitations, the pretense of belonging. A choice that would leave her standing alone but free. What she did next would ensure her family never looked at her the same way again. Ella's decision did not come with fireworks or shouting matches. It came in the stillness of her apartment one evening, suitcase open on the bed, the skyline blinking through her window like 1,000 watchful eyes. She folded her clothes slowly, not with hesitation, but with finality, each garment a statement of departure. The phone rang several times, her mother, her father, Sophie. But she let it ring until the sound stopped echoing through the room. She had already heard their arguments, their warnings, their disdain. She would not hear them again. When she boarded the plane to Montana, her chest tightened with both fear and relief. The city that had shaped her was slipping away beneath the clouds, its towers shrinking until they were nothing more than shadows. She felt the weight of everything she was leaving: her family's approval, the social circles she had been trained to navigate, the comfort of familiarity. Yet with each mile west, she also felt lighter. For once, she was not choosing for them. She was choosing for herself. Luke met her at the small regional airport, his truck parked by the gate, his smile as steady as the mountains that rose behind him. He didn't ask if she was sure. He simply took her bag, loaded it into the truck, and reached for her hand. The gravel crunched under their tires as they drove out into a landscape that stretched wide in unbroken golden fields, swaying beneath a sky that seemed impossibly vast. Ella rolled down the window, letting the wind tangle her hair, the scent of earth and grass filling her lungs. It was so different from the city's sharp edges that she felt as if she were stepping into another life entirely. Their wedding was held a few months later, not in a cathedral or a ballroom, but in a meadow just beyond Luke's farmhouse. The sky itself was their ceiling, the rolling hills their walls. Wildflowers lined the path she walked, carrying a bouquet cut fresh that morning. A few neighbors gathered, kind souls who brought pies and hand-sewn quilts as gifts. Luke wore a simple suit and Ella a plain white dress without designer labels. It was quiet, intimate, and achingly real. But her family was not there. The chairs she had reserved for them remained empty, a reminder of what she had left behind. Days before, her mother had called one final time. Her voice, clipped and cold, carried words Ella knew she would never forget. "You're marrying down. Don't expect us to help you back up." With that, the line had gone dead, and with it any lingering hope of reconciliation. Ella stood at the altar with Luke, her hand in his, her heart steady. The vows they exchanged were not about legacy or wealth, but about seasons, patience, and endurance. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the meadow erupted with applause from the handful of neighbors. But Ella's eyes filled with tears, not for the absence of family, but for the presence of something truer. She was not marrying down. She was rising into a life where she could finally breathe. Later that evening, as the last of the guests left and the lanterns flickered against the dusk, a sudden summer rain began to fall. Ella stepped outside alone, letting the drops soak her hair and dress, the mud softening beneath her feet. She tilted her face toward the sky, arms slightly spread, and felt the rain wash away the remnants of her old life. Behind her, Luke called for her to come inside, but she lingered, standing in the storm, as if baptizing herself into the life she had chosen. In that moment, she felt both fragile and unbreakable. She knew the cost of her decision: the silence from her family, the sneers from her old circle, the severed ties that could never be mended. Yet she also knew that love worth choosing was never measured in pedigrees or parties. It was measured in the strength to stand in the rain alone if necessary and still feel whole. She walked back into the farmhouse, her dress clinging, her heart resolute. Luke wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, his warmth grounding her as the storm raged outside. She had crossed a line that could never be erased, and she was ready to face whatever storms might follow. What Ella did not know was that her new life, so simple and promising, would soon be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. The quiet joy of the farm would not remain untouched. A loss was waiting on the horizon, one that would strike at the heart of her newfound happiness and force her to confront pain deeper than family rejection ever could. The first months on the farm felt like stepping into a new rhythm, one that Ella's body and mind had never known. The mornings began before sunrise, when the fields were still gray and the air held a sharp chill. Luke would brew coffee strong enough to jolt the sleep from her eyes, hand her a steaming mug, and smile before heading out to tend the animals. She followed him, at first awkward in borrowed boots that rubbed her heels raw, her manicured hands clumsy with ropes and feed. Every task was foreign, from gathering eggs to hauling water, yet Luke's patience never faltered. He laughed softly when she dropped a pail or stumbled over uneven ground, not mocking but steady, as if her efforts alone were enough. Ella began to learn. She planted rows of vegetables in soil dark and fragrant, her nails caked with dirt that no salon could ever scrub clean. At night she scrubbed her hands raw, but she carried a quiet pride when shoots appeared green and defiant against the wind. She learned the sharp scent of hay, the weight of rain-soaked laundry, the sting of winter wind that slipped through the cracks of the old farmhouse. The conveniences of the city delivery service's doorman taxis waiting at the curb were gone. In their place came evenings by the wood stove, the smell of soup simmering, and the sound of Luke's steady voice recounting the day. Despite the challenges, Ella discovered joy in the simplicity. She and Luke often walked the fields at dusk, their hands brushing as the sky bled into orange and violet. They paused to watch the horizon stretch endlessly, a view no skyscraper could match. Sometimes they said nothing at all, letting the quiet settle over them like a blanket. For Ella, those moments were more valuable than any glittering party she had once attended. They were reminders that life did not need to be grand to be meaningful. But the farm demanded more than sentiment. There were days when machinery broke down, when storms threatened to drown crops, when exhaustion clung to their bodies like mud. Ella learned resilience not from choice but from necessity. She rose with Luke in the cold dawn, her muscles aching, and worked until her body cried for rest. At night, she collapsed into bed, too tired even to dream, but she carried the satisfaction of knowing she had survived the day. Slowly, she felt herself becoming part of the land, her city polish worn away, until something truer shone through. Amid the toil, happiness bloomed in unexpected ways. One late spring evening, when the air was sweet with lilac, Ella discovered she was pregnant. She told Luke under the wide sky, her voice trembling with both fear and wonder. His arms wrapped around her strong and protective, his forehead pressed against hers, as he whispered promises she barely heard through her own pounding heart. They began to imagine a future, tiny clothes folded in drawers, a cradle by the bed, the sound of laughter filling the farmhouse. For weeks, Ella carried that dream, tenderly guarding it like the most fragile treasure. Then, without warning, it slipped away. A sharp pain one morning, the rush to the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the doctor's hushed words. Ella lay in the stark white room, her body hollowed out, her arms empty. Luke held her hand, his face pale with grief, but no comfort could soften the loss. She returned home to the farm, the fields still stretching wide, the sun still setting in glory. But everything seemed muted, dulled by sorrow. The nights were the hardest. She lay awake listening to the creak of the farmhouse, the distant lowing of cattle, the silence that pressed against her chest. Luke tried to reach her, to remind her that they still had each other. But grief is a private language, and Ella could not find the words to translate hers. In the stillness, she felt the echo of another loss, the family who had turned their backs, the mother who had once sung to her but now would not call. She thought of how easily they had cast her aside, and how desperately she had wanted to prove she could thrive without them. Now, empty and broken, she wondered if they had been right all along. Days stretched into weeks. Slowly, Ella forced herself back into the rhythm of the farm, though the joy of planting of sunsets felt distant. She clung to Luke, to his steadiness, but part of her carried a wound that would not heal quickly. The fields did not pause for grief. The animals still needed feeding, the land still demanded care. In that relentless cycle, Ella found a measure of strength. She rose each morning, wiped her tears in secret, and walked into the day. She began to smile again, faintly at first, when Luke caught her hand and pulled her into a slow dance in the kitchen, when the dog bounded through the fields, when neighbors brought pies to remind her she was not alone. Healing was not swift, but it was real. Just as she began to believe that peace might settle over them again, the phone rang late one evening. The sound startled her sharp in the quiet farmhouse. She lifted the receiver, expecting a neighbor or perhaps a wrong number. But the voice on the other end froze her blood. It was a voice from the past, a reminder of wounds that had never fully closed, and with it came the first spark of anger that would burn hotter than grief. The phone call that shattered the quiet of the farmhouse left Ella shaken for hours afterward. It had not been her mother or father on the line, but a mutual acquaintance from her old world, a woman who still attended the same charity galas and luncheons her family frequented. The voice was careful, almost sympathetic, yet every word struck like a blade. Her parents, the woman confided, had interfered in far more of Ella's life than she realized. It wasn't only their disapproval of Luke or their constant reminders to marry up. They had worked in shadows for years, nudging, pushing, sometimes outright blocking paths that might have led Ella elsewhere. After she hung up, Ella sat by the kitchen table long into the night, her hands folded tightly in her lap. At first, she wanted to dismiss it as gossip, another poisoned dart from the world she thought she had left behind. But the more she turned it over in her mind, the more the pieces began to fit. Memories that had seemed innocuous now sharpened into something darker. She recalled the summer she had begged to take a painting class in Italy, only to be told that it would make her look unserious, frivolous in the eyes of important connections. Her father had suggested a business internship instead, one that had led her neatly into the career her family approved of. She thought of the time she had wanted to publish a small collection of sketches during college, only to have her mother dismiss the idea as childish doodles that would embarrass the family name. Even friendships had been curated with her parents discouraging her from spending time with those they considered beneath their circle. As she replayed these moments, she realized how many times she had silenced her own desires. Each dream she had folded away like delicate paper tucked into a drawer and forgotten. At the time, she had told herself she was being sensible, practical, loyal to her family. Now, in the quiet of her farmhouse kitchen, she saw the truth. She had been controlled, shaped into the perfect daughter her parents wanted with no regard for the person she might have become. The realization lit a spark of anger deep inside her. It was not the wild fury of the young, but something heavier forged from years of quiet submission. She gripped her mug so tightly the porcelain threatened to crack. How much of her life had been stolen from her under the guise of love and guidance? How much of herself had been lost in the process? She thought of the miscarriage, the hollow ache that still lingered, and she felt a bitter pang at how her parents would have likely dismissed that pain too, reducing it to inconvenience or weakness. For a fleeting moment, Ella considered calling them not to beg, but to confront. She wanted to throw their manipulation in their faces, to force them to hear the rage she had buried for decades. But then she glanced toward the stairs where Luke was asleep, his steady breathing drifting down into the silence. He had given her sanctuary, a chance at a different life. She could not let her anger drag her back into the world she had chosen to leave. Protecting her fragile peace mattered more than proving her point. So she swallowed the fury, burying it under the same discipline her parents had once demanded. In the morning she rose as usual, helped Luke with chores, smiled when neighbors stopped by. To the outside world, she appeared calm, even serene. But inside her chest, a storm brewed. The truth had cracked open old wounds, and though she tried to ignore them, they pulsed with a pain she could not quite numb. It was in this fragile state that Ella began to notice small changes in Luke's behavior. He grew quieter at times, slipping away without explanation for hours, sometimes days. When she asked where he had been, he would smile and kiss her cheek, saying only, "Business in town. Nothing to worry about." But there was something in his eyes, something guarded, almost secretive, that stirred unease. Once she found a receipt tucked into his jacket from a company she didn't recognize, printed with numbers that made little sense for the kind of farm purchases she was used to seeing. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination magnifying ordinary things because of the shadows her family had stirred. Yet the doubt lingered, growing each time he left without details, each time his phone buzzed and he stepped outside to answer. She wanted to trust him. She did trust him, but the past had taught her that trust could be a fragile illusion. And now, with suspicion gnawing at her, Ella faced a terrifying question. What if the one person she had chosen over everything else was hiding a truth of his own? At first, Ella thought little of Luke's absences. Farming life was unpredictable, filled with errands that could stretch for hours or even days when machinery failed or livestock required transport. But gradually the pattern became too regular to ignore. Once a month, sometimes twice, Luke would pack a small bag and leave before dawn, returning days later with little explanation. When she asked where he had gone, his reply was always the same, spoken with quiet conviction, but no detail for our future. Trust me. The words should have reassured her, yet instead they lodged in her chest like a stone. Trust had always been difficult for Ella. Years of bending to her family's will had taught her that promises could be laced with manipulation, that guidance could mask control. Luke was nothing like them, or at least she had believed so. But the secrecy unsettled her. Each time he disappeared down the dirt road, leaving her in the vast quiet of the farm, she felt the echo of old doubts. She had left her family to build something honest, to live without pretense. Yet here she was again, wondering if the ground beneath her was shifting. The moment that deepened her suspicion came on an ordinary afternoon. Luke had left 2 days earlier, and Ella was gathering laundry from his jacket when a folded slip of paper fell from the pocket. It was a receipt printed with the logo of a major technology corporation she recognized from her years in New York. The amount was staggering, far beyond the cost of farm supplies or repairs. The description listed only a vague consultation fee. Ella stared at it, her fingers trembling, her mind racing with questions. What business did a Montana farmer have with one of the largest tech firms in the country? She tucked the receipt away, unsure whether to confront him or wait. When Luke returned that evening, his smile was warm, his kiss gentle, his arms wrapping around her as though nothing had changed. She almost convinced herself to let it go, but the receipt burned in her memory. During dinner, she asked again where he had been. He looked at her across the table, his eyes steady but distant, and repeated the phrase she had come to dread for our future. Trust me. His silence built walls between them. Ella felt herself pacing the kitchen when he was gone, glancing out at the empty drive, listening for the sound of his truck. When he returned, the ease between them had thinned their conversations shorter, their laughter less frequent. She hated herself for doubting him, but the shadows of her family's betrayal colored every thought. Had she leapt from one cage into another, blinded again by love and hope? The loneliness pressed heavier as the weeks went on. At night she lay awake, Luke asleep beside her, her mind circling the same questions. What was he hiding? Why couldn't he tell her? She thought of the trust she had placed in her family, only to discover how they had twisted her life to suit their image. She thought of her miscarriage, the grief she had carried largely in silence. She had chosen Luke because he represented honesty, because his life seemed rooted in soil rather than status. Now she wondered if she had been naive. One afternoon, as she sorted through the day's mail, she found an envelope tucked among the usual bills and catalogs. Her name was printed in elegant script, the paper heavy, the kind used for events where image mattered more than sincerity. She slid it open with a kitchen knife and unfolded the card. Her stomach tightened as her eyes skimmed the words, an invitation to her cousin's wedding in New York. The date was set, the venue grand, and at the bottom was a note scrawled in her mother's hand. It was short-pointed, impossible to misinterpret, no +1. Ella gripped the card, her pulse pounding in her ears. The insult was deliberate, cruel, meant to remind her that Luke would never be welcome in their world. She stood in the kitchen, the farm stretching silent outside the window, the memory of the receipt burning in her pocket. Between her family's mockery and Luke's growing secrecy, Ella felt herself caught between two storms, each threatening to tear her apart. She had walked away from her family once, but this invitation would force her back into their orbit, whether she was ready or not. Ella stood in her kitchen, the invitation heavy in her hand, the script elegant and polished, as if the weight of tradition alone could make it kind. But it wasn't. At the bottom of the card, beneath the curling letters announcing her cousin's wedding, was the line that cut sharper than any insult whispered behind her back, no +1. They hadn't bothered with subtlety. The message was clear. Luke was not welcome. He never would be. She stared at it for a long time, her chest tightening until her breath came shallow. They had not simply excluded him from the guest list. They had erased him from her life as if he were an inconvenience they could discard with ink. She remembered the countless times her parents had used similar tactics, how they had shamed her out of painting, maneuvered her into careers that reflected well on them, clipped her wings before she ever had the chance to fly. This note was nothing new. It was simply the latest weapon in a long arsenal of humiliation. The phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Sophie lit up the screen, each word steeped in condescension. "You chose a farmer over us. Don't embarrass us again." Ella's thumb hovered over the screen. 1,000 replies rushed through her mind, some scathing, some pleading, some that begged for a sister she no longer believed existed. Instead, she set the phone down, her hand trembling. Rage and shame churned inside her, colliding until her stomach ached. She had thought leaving had freed her, but here it was again, the power her family still held to reduce her to a girl at their table, silenced with a look, dismissed with a phrase. Luke found her later that evening, still at the counter, the card and phone beside her like twin knives. He touched her shoulder gently, his eyes searching her face. She wanted to tell him everything, to hand him the insult so he could see what they thought of him, but the words caught in her throat. His absences, his secrets, the widening gap between them, they all tangled with her family's cruelty until she could barely separate one wound from the other. So she only said, "They sent an invitation." Luke's brow furrowed, but he said nothing. His silence was meant to be a comfort, but in that moment it only deepened the hollow inside her. She wished he would rage, curse them, demand to go with her. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her, murmured, "You don't owe them anything," and left it at that. But Ella felt she did owe them something, not compliance, not obedience, but confrontation. She could not bear to let them believe she was too ashamed to stand in their presence. For too long she had walked away in silence, allowed them to control the narrative. If they thought she would hide in Montana, too humiliated to face them, then they did not know her at all. Over the next week the decision crystallized. She would go. She would walk into their world on her own terms. She would sit in their gilded halls, look them in the eye, and let them see that their rejection had not destroyed her. They had called her a barn wife, erased her husband, reduced her to nothing. Yet she was still standing. She would make them face that truth. Still at night, doubt gnawed at her resolve. She lay awake, listening to Luke's breathing, the receipt from the technology company hidden in her drawer, the memory of his evasions pressing at her mind. Could she truly defend her choices if she wasn't certain of the man she had chosen? The thought sickened her, but the shame from her family burned hotter. Whatever Luke was hiding, it could not be worse than the disdain of those who should have loved her. When the day of departure drew near, she packed carefully each dress and pair of shoes, a reminder that she still knew how to play their game. She slipped the invitation into her bag, its cruel note now fueling her determination. She would walk into that wedding alone if she had to, but she would not walk in broken. On the eve of her journey, a call came through from the same acquaintance who had once warned her of her parents' interference. The voice was lower this time, more urgent. "Be careful, Ella," the woman said. "This isn't just about a wedding. They've been planning something. I shouldn't be telling you this. But—" The line crackled, then went dead, leaving Ella clutching the receiver, her heart hammering. The insult of the invitation had stung, but now a darker truth loomed. Her family wasn't merely trying to humiliate her. They were preparing something far more deliberate, and she was walking straight into it. Ella arrived in New York with her nerves wound tight, the invitation heavy in her purse like a stone. She told herself she was ready for the sharp looks, the whispered insults, the cold dismissal. What she wasn't prepared for was Rachel waiting for her in the lobby of the hotel where most of the family was staying. Rachel, younger by a few years, had always lingered at the edges of their gatherings, quiet, overlooked, more often ignored than embraced. Now she approached Ella with eyes darting, her voice low and urgent. "We need to talk," she said, tugging at Ella's arm before she could refuse. They found a quiet corner in the cafe, the clatter of dishes covering their words. Rachel leaned forward, her expression tight. They've hired someone, a private investigator, to dig into Luke, to find anything they can twist against you. The words landed like a blow. Ella felt the blood rush to her ears, her pulse thundering. What she whispered. Rachel nodded, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin. Your father and Sophie, they're paying for it. They want to humiliate you at the wedding to prove you chose wrong, that he's not who you think he is. For a moment, Ella couldn't breathe. The cruelty wasn't surprising, but the calculated malice of it cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Her family wasn't content with rejection. They wanted destruction. She pressed her hands to her temples, fighting the nausea rising in her throat. Why are you telling me this? Rachel's voice wavered, but her eyes held steady. Because I'm tired of watching them tear people apart, and because I know you loved me once, even when no one else bothered to notice I was there. That night, Ella confronted Luke. He stood at the window of their rented room, looking out at the city lights when she told him what Rachel had revealed. For a long time, he didn't answer. Then he turned, his expression calm but solemn. I know, he said simply. Ella's heart jolted. You know? And you didn't tell me. Luke stepped closer, taking her hand. They can dig all they want. They'll find nothing that matters. The truth will outshine their lies. I didn't want to burden you with their poison. His confidence should have soothed her, but instead it unsettled her. What truth? What shadows lingered in his past that he thought could stand against such scrutiny? She searched his face, but his eyes, though steady, revealed nothing. She wanted to trust him. She had chosen him over everything. Yet the silence between his words gnawed at her resolve. The next day, while dressing for a brunch that preceded the wedding, Ella's phone buzzed with a message from an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. The friend had read she was in town and wanted to warn her about something she had overheard at a gala long ago. Ella's father, the friend claimed, had orchestrated the end of her college romance. Back then, Ella had loved a young man named Daniel, a fellow student with big dreams and little money. Their connection had been pure, untainted by status. She had thought it ended because of distance, because Daniel had pulled away without explanation. Now, with the phone in her hand, she learned the truth. Her father had threatened him, promised to ruin his prospects if he stayed with her. Daniel had left to protect her, not because he stopped loving her. The revelation tore through her like fire. All these years, she had carried the quiet ache of that loss, believing she had been naive, foolish, unworthy of lasting love. Now she saw it for what it was, another theft, another manipulation by a man who thought his control extended to every corner of her heart. Rage surged hot and unrelenting. How many pieces of her life had they stolen without her even knowing? How many choices had never been hers? When she arrived at the wedding venue, her head was high but her stomach churned. The chandeliers glittered, the tables gleamed, and her family moved among the guests with practiced smiles. She felt the sting of their eyes, the weight of their judgment, but beneath it all, her anger simmered. She knew now the lengths they would go to the malice that hid behind their refinement. As she took her seat, a whisper ran through the crowd, subtle at first, then louder. People were looking at her, glancing away, murmuring behind their hands. Ella's skin prickled as she realized the moment she had feared was coming. Whatever game her family had prepared, whatever lies they had bought, the humiliation they planned, was about to unfold, and she was trapped in the center of it. Ella barely slept the night before the ceremony. The knowledge of her father's interference in her past, the looming threat of whatever scheme they had prepared, and the lingering silence from Luke all pressed down on her chest until she felt she could hardly breathe. The hotel room seemed too small. The city outside too loud, and every time she closed her eyes she saw her father's cold expression, Sophie's triumphant smirk, her mother's disdain thinly veiled as composure. She had told herself she came here to prove she was unbroken, but in the stillness of that night she wondered if she was walking straight into their trap. When morning came, Luke brewed coffee in the small room's kitchenette. He moved with his usual calmness, but Ella sensed unease in the way his hand lingered on the mug he handed her. She took it grateful for the warmth against her trembling fingers. They sat in silence until he finally asked, his voice low and heavy with concern. "Are you sure you want to go to that wedding?" His eyes searched hers, not with doubt in her strength, but with worry for the wounds he knew they could inflict. He had seen her break before. He had seen her claw her way back from the grief of their loss. He didn't want to watch her be torn apart again. Ella met his gaze, her own heart thudding hard. "If I don't go, they win," she said softly. "They'll say I was too ashamed to show my face, too weak to stand in their world. I can't give them that." Luke reached for her hand, his thumb brushing the inside of her wrist as if trying to steady her pulse. "It's not weakness to walk away," he whispered. She shook her head, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "It is, if it means they still own me." The words surprised her even as she said them. She hadn't realized until that moment how much power her family's shadow still held. She thought she had escaped by moving to Montana, by choosing Luke, by planting herself in soil that was truly hers. But she carried them still, the weight of their scorn, the echo of their judgment. Attending this wedding was not about reconciliation. It was about reclaiming herself in the only language they understood, standing tall where they expected her to shrink. Luke pulled her into his arms, his chin resting on her hair. For a moment she let herself sink into his steadiness, but beneath it her own resolve burned. She would go. She would endure whatever spectacle they had prepared, and if they tried to break her, she would not bend this time. As the car carried them to the venue, Ella watched the city blur past the windows. Every landmark held a memory, each one tangled with her family's grip on her life. The private schools, the exclusive clubs, the skyscrapers her father once boasted of financing. It all felt distant and hollow now, yet she knew how much pride her family drew from these symbols, and she knew how easily they could use them as weapons. She straightened her spine, inhaling deeply as the car slowed before the grand doors of the hall. Inside, the air was heavy with perfume, laughter, and the clink of crystal glasses. Guests glittered in designer gowns and tuxedos, the chandeliers raining light down on polished marble floors. It was a world Ella had once moved through with ease, but tonight every eye seemed sharper, every smile edged with curiosity. She walked in alone, Luke lingering near the entrance as though giving her space to face what lay ahead. Whispers rose and fell around her, subtle but undeniable, and she felt the burn of being appraised, measured, dismissed. At the front of the room, her family stood greeting guests. Sophie beamed radiant in her role as hostess, while their parents flanked her like a royal court. When Ella approached, the temperature seemed to drop. Her father's jaw tightened. Her mother's lips curved into a smile too brittle to be kind, and Sophie's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Ella braced herself, every step measured, her head held high. She reminded herself with each breath that she was no longer the girl they could bend to their will. But as she reached the reception area, one of the ushers intercepted her with an apologetic glance. He gestured to her seat, and Ella's stomach dropped when she saw where it was, at a small table tucked near the restroom doors, far from the glittering heart of the celebration. Around her, people murmured the message obvious. They had placed her where the smell of disinfectant lingered, where guests would pass with sidelong glances, where no one of consequence would sit. Her face burned. She felt the humiliation rise like a wave, threatening to crash and drown her resolve. This was no accident. It was calculated, deliberate, another move in their game to remind her that she was beneath them, that her choices had stripped her of place and worth. Her chest ached with the weight of it, her vision blurring as she lowered herself into the chair. She had told herself she was prepared. She had told Luke she would not let them win. But sitting there, the noise of laughter spilling across the ballroom, she felt the crack of something deep inside. She had reached the moment she had feared most, the edge of her endurance. What came next would either break her completely or force her to rise in a way she never had before. The stench of disinfectant lingered faintly where Ella sat, the hum of the ballroom muffled by the steady opening and closing of the restroom door just a few feet away. Guests swept past her table without a glance, their silks and satins brushing against her chair, as if she were part of the decor rather than family. The music was soft, the clink of glasses constant, yet she felt each sound like a needle against her skin. She forced herself to straighten her back, her fingers clasped tightly around her napkin as whispers drifted from the neighboring tables. "That's her," a woman murmured, her tone pitched just high enough to carry. "The one who married the farmer." Another chuckle followed. "Imagine throwing away everything for dirt under your nails." She could have had anyone. Then, sharpest of all, a voice laughed outright. "Barn wife." That's what she is now. The words, spat with casual cruelty, cut deeper than they could have known. Ella's face burned, though she kept her eyes fixed on her plate. She wanted to stand to shout to defend the life she had chosen, but her throat closed around the words. She had expected disdain, even insults, but hearing them aloud, repeated like gossip at a market stall, stripped her of breath. When the speeches began, she turned her gaze toward the head table. Her father rose first, his voice booming across the hall, practiced and polished, thanking guests for sharing in their family's joy. He spoke of Sophie, radiant and accomplished, and of the groom, a man worthy of her hand. Applause followed, glasses lifted, and for a fleeting second, Ella braced for her name, for even the barest acknowledgement that she too was his daughter. But the words never came. He set his glass down, smiling with pride, and sat. Her mother followed, dabbing delicately at her eyes, voice trembling with carefully staged emotion. She spoke of Sophie's beauty, of her grace, of the future she deserved. She thanked guests for celebrating with our beloved daughter and wished the couple every happiness. Once again, Ella's name was absent, scrubbed clean from the narrative, as if she had never belonged at all. By the time Sophie stood, Ella's chest was tight with both fury and despair. Her sister glowed, basking in the attention, her words dripping with charm. "I've been blessed with the most supportive parents," she said, "who always guided me, always made sure I chose wisely. I owe them everything." Her gaze slid across the room, resting briefly on Ella with a glint of triumph before moving on. "They taught me what happens when choices are made in haste, without thinking of consequences." A ripple of laughter swept the hall. The barb was unmistakable. Ella's vision blurred. She gripped the edge of the table, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. The napkin twisted in her hands until it tore. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, before the weight of their rejection crushed her completely. But she remained seated, the humiliation pressing down until she thought she might break apart. She remembered Luke's worried question in their hotel room. "Are you sure you want to go to that wedding?" She had nodded, certain she could endure whatever came. Now, with laughter echoing in her ears and whispers clawing at her back, she wasn't sure anymore. The strength she had carried in with her felt like sand slipping through her fingers. The speeches ended, the music swelled again, and Ella sat in silence. Her body rigid, her heart ached with the emptiness of being erased by the people who should have cherished her most. She wanted to believe she was stronger than this, but in that moment, she felt invisible, small, and unbearably alone. Then, just as the noise of the celebration rose, a new sound cracked through the air. At first it was a low vibration, a tremor that rattled the glassware on the tables. Guests glanced upward, murmurs rippling as the chandeliers quivered slightly. The vibration grew louder, steady, and insistent until it swallowed the music entirely. People rose from their chairs, necks craning, confusion spreading across the ballroom. Ella's breath caught in her throat. A distant thunder was descending, not from the sky, but from above the building itself. A sound powerful enough to silence 200 voices in an instant. Something was coming, and it was about to shatter the night in ways no one could have imagined. The rumble grew until it drowned out every sound in the ballroom. Guests rushed to the windows, craning their necks toward the night sky. Outside, over the manicured lawns and white tents of the wedding lights blinked in a slow descent. At first, no one could believe what they were seeing. A private jet, sleek and gleaming under the floodlights, was lowering toward the open field just beyond the reception hall. Its engines roared, scattering leaves and rattling champagne flutes on their stems. The orchestra faltered bows, dropping mid-note as the entire celebration shifted its gaze to the spectacle unfolding outside. Ella rose to her feet, her pulse hammering in her ears. For a moment she thought she was dreaming that grief and humiliation had finally spun into delusion. But as the jet's wheels kissed the ground and the plane rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust, reality settled hard in her chest. The ballroom had fallen into silence, broken only by the scrape of chairs as guests hurried closer to see. Conversations sparked speculation, curiosity, disbelief, but none louder than the single truth pulsing in Ella's mind. The cabin door opened, a stair unfolded with deliberate grace, and there he was. Luke stepped into the glow of the floodlights, his presence so commanding it cut through the haze of dust and disbelief. Gone was the man in faded flannel and worn boots. In his place stood a figure that belonged to another world entirely. His suit was tailored to perfection, the dark fabric catching the light with understated elegance. At his wrist gleamed a watch vintage and unmistakably rare, the kind her father used to boast about in his collection. His shoes shone polished leather that had never seen mud or hay. He descended each step with calm assurance, as though arriving at such an event was nothing out of the ordinary. The guests gasped. Some covered their mouths. Others whispered his name without knowing who he was, the image alone enough to stir awe. The same people who had moments before mocked Ella for being married to a farmer now clutched each other's arms, struggling to understand what they were seeing. Her parents stood frozen near the head table, their expressions a study in shock. Her father's face drained of color, her mother's painted smile faltering as though it might crack. Sophie, radiant in her gown, stared as though the ground beneath her had tilted. Ella could not move, her eyes locked on Luke, her heart tumbling between disbelief and something fiercer, sharper. He walked toward the hall, each step measured, his gaze steady and unflinching. He moved through the crowd that had spilled outside, heads turning, whispers rising. By the time he reached the doorway, silence had fallen again, the kind of silence that carries awe and fear in equal measure. He paused at the threshold, his eyes finding hers across the room. In that instant, she saw him differently, not as the man who woke with the dawn to tend cattle, not as the figure who disappeared on mysterious trips with little explanation. Here was a man who belonged to both worlds, and perhaps to one that stretched even beyond them. The farmer she loved and the stranger she barely knew had merged into one, standing tall before her family and every guest who had ever doubted him. Her father took an uncertain step forward. His voice strained as he called out, "What is the meaning of this?" But his words fell flat, swallowed by the sight of Luke standing in tailored perfection, untouched by the sneers that had haunted the night. The whispers rippled faster now, speculation crashing against disbelief. Was he a businessman? A dignitary? A magnate hiding behind the guise of soil and cattle? No one could make sense of it, and that confusion was its own kind of power. Ella's breath caught as Luke's lips curved into the faintest smile, a gesture not of arrogance, but of quiet certainty. She had spent months doubting his absences, fearing his secrets. Now, as he stood framed by the glittering chandeliers and the stunned faces of her family, she realized that whatever truth he carried, it was larger than she had ever dared imagine. The ballroom moments ago alive with laughter at her expense, now waited in hushed anticipation. They had called her a barn wife, mocked her for lowering herself, erased her from their speeches. But all of it teetered on the edge of collapse because the man they had dismissed as nothing had just arrived like a storm to rewrite the script. Ella's hands trembled, her mind racing with questions that could not yet be answered. The humiliation of the evening still burned, but beneath it surged something else, an electric sense that the tide was about to turn. Luke had come not merely to stand at her side, but to shatter every illusion her family had built. The roar of the jet still echoed faintly outside, a reminder of the power that had just descended onto their carefully curated world. And as Luke took his first step into the ballroom, every eye fixed on him, Ella knew the secret he carried was about to change everything. The air in the ballroom was so still that Ella could hear the faint ticking of the chandelier's crystal pendants above. Luke stepped forward, his presence commanding silence without raising his voice. He stood tall, his gaze steady every inch of him, a contradiction to the image her family had painted. For a long moment he let the quiet stretch, allowing the weight of his arrival to settle over the room. Then, with the calm authority of a man who owed nothing to anyone present, he began to speak. "My name is Luke Reynolds," he said, his voice deep measured, carrying to every corner of the hall. "Some of you know me only as a farmer. That is true, I am a farmer. But I am also the owner of Reynolds Agricultural Group, a family enterprise that now spans over 17,000 acres across Montana, Nebraska, and Kansas." Murmurs erupted, sharp gasps breaking the silence as guests turned to one another. 17,000 acres. The figure alone was staggering, its magnitude incomprehensible to those who measured wealth in penthouses and portfolios. Luke continued, unshaken by the reaction. "Agriculture is the backbone of this country. It feeds our people, sustains our economy, and holds our future. But I knew long ago that to survive we could not farm the way our fathers and grandfathers did. We needed to innovate. So I became an early investor in AgriNext Technologies, a company committed to sustainable solutions for farming on a global scale. Today, I am one of its largest shareholders. And in 2 weeks' time, when AgriNext goes public, it will be valued among the most significant IPOs of the decade." A stunned silence followed before whispers rolled like thunder through the crowd. Ella caught fragments of disbelief. Agri. Next Forbes covered them last month. Is he serious? Then another voice, awed, almost reverent, the quiet king of American soil. Heads swiveled, eyes widened. People reached for their phones, searching for confirmation, and gasps rose again as they found the truth printed in headlines. Forbes had indeed profiled him, naming him just that, the quiet king, the man who had built an agricultural empire without stepping into the spotlight. Luke's expression softened, but his voice did not waver. "Some of you may think this was luck. It was not. I lost everything once. Years ago, I trusted the wrong partners, and my farm went under. I stood in empty fields, staring at debts higher than the sky, wondering if I had failed not just myself, but generations before me. I had a choice: walk away or rebuild. I chose to rebuild. I worked day and night. I gambled on new methods. I risked what little I had left. And slowly, season by season, I grew again. Not just crops, but a business that could stand against any storm." His words struck Ella with a force she hadn't expected. She had always loved him for his honesty, for the steadiness he carried into their quiet life. But here in this room filled with doubters, she saw another side of him, a man who had fallen to the bottom and clawed his way back, who had carried the weight of failure and still built something indestructible. He wasn't simply surviving. He was thriving on a scale her family could never have imagined. Around the room, jaws hung slack. Men who had dismissed him now looked uneasy, their faces pale. Women whispered behind their hands, no longer in mockery, but in shock. Even the orchestra had fallen silent, instruments resting in laps as musicians stared. Ella turned toward her parents. Her mother's hands gripped the back of a chair, knuckles white, while her father's jaw worked furiously as though he might grind his teeth to dust. Sophie's face was hardest to read, somewhere between fury, disbelief, and something uglier still, envy. Luke's gaze swept the room but always returned to Ella, grounding her in the storm of attention. "I didn't come here tonight to make a spectacle," he said finally. "I came because the woman you tried to humiliate is my wife. She chose me not for acres or investments, not for titles or recognition, but for who I am. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is more wealth than anything I own." Ella's throat tightened. For a heartbeat she thought she might break into tears, but pride held her steady. The girl they had dismissed, the daughter they had erased, stood taller now, not because she demanded respect, but because she had chosen love that outshone their scorn. The applause did not come. Instead, there was a silence thick with shock, broken only by the scrape of her father's chair as he rose to his feet. His face was dark with suppressed rage, his voice low but seething. "Enough of this performance," he snapped. "You think acres make you a man. You think money makes you worthy of her." His eyes burned into Luke, then shifted to Ella with equal venom. "We will see how long this fairy tale lasts, when truth comes crashing down." The tension in the room spiked a rope pulled taut to breaking. Ella felt every eye flick between them, waiting hungry for the next blow. She knew in her bones that her family's response would not be surrender. They had been embarrassed before 200 guests, their narrative shattered, their authority undermined. They would not accept it quietly. The storm was only beginning, and the fury about to descend would test her resolve like never before. The room was still vibrating with the weight of Luke's words when the first shift in atmosphere occurred. Only moments earlier, Ella had been the object of ridicule whispered about, as if she were nothing more than a cautionary tale. Now, in the glow of Luke's revelation, the same people who had laughed were rearranging their expressions into smiles, eager to position themselves near power they hadn't seen coming. The applause her father had refused to give was replaced by murmurs of admiration, the kind that cling to wealth like moths to flame. Sophie moved first. She slipped from her place at the head table and crossed the floor with the grace of someone who had always been watched. Her gown shimmered under the chandeliers as though it had been made for this exact moment. She smiled at Luke, her voice soft and admiring, almost cloying. "Luke, I must say you've kept quite the secret. 17,000 acres, Agri. Next, it's remarkable. We really underestimated you." She let out a light laugh as though their insults had been playful banter instead of cruel daggers. "You must forgive us. We didn't realize what vision you carried." Their mother followed with equal swiftness, her tone coated in sweetness Ella had rarely been offered in her life. "Indeed, Luke," she said, touching her pearls, as though steadying herself against her own astonishment. "It takes a rare kind of man to build something so formidable. You know I always admired farmers, such hard workers, and clearly you are much more than that." Her eyes flicked toward Ella briefly before returning to Luke, a silent attempt to erase the disdain she had poured on her daughter for years. "We'd love to hear more about your plans, perhaps even find ways to support such admirable work." Ella watched in silence, her stomach twisting. She had expected anger denial, a desperate attempt to discredit him. Instead, they pivoted with practiced ease, shedding cruelty as if it were nothing more than a coat out of season. Their hypocrisy was as breathtaking as it was sickening. She could see Sophie's lashes lowered just so her smile sharpened to suggestion the subtle tilt of her shoulders that hinted at flirtation. Her mother's feigned warmth wasn't aimed at reconciliation, but at reattaching themselves to the image of power they thought they had lost. Luke, however, was immovable. He inclined his head politely, but his gaze never wavered toward either Sophie or her mother. When Sophie rested her hand lightly on his arm, he shifted almost imperceptibly, letting her touch slide away without acknowledgement. His expression remained composed, his attention fixed on one person, only Ella. It was a quiet defiance, an unspoken declaration that no amount of admiration or opportunism could sway his loyalty. Ella's heart clenched. She had doubted him, wondered at his absences, feared what secrets he kept. Yet in this moment, under the harsh lights of judgment and hypocrisy, she saw him for what he truly was. Not just a man of wealth or vision, but a man who chose her in the face of every other temptation. She felt tears sting her eyes, but she held them back, unwilling to give her family the satisfaction of seeing her undone again. Around them, guests adjusted swiftly, laughter, returning voices rising in praise. Men approached Luke with firm handshakes, eager to align themselves with a rising titan. Women leaned closer, their compliments laced with curiosity and calculation. But Luke stood like a rock in a rushing stream, unmoved by the tide. Every time he turned his head, it was toward Ella, as though the chaos around them did not exist. The more her family tried to cloak their scorn in admiration, the more hollow it sounded. Ella's mother laughed too loudly at nothing. Her sister leaned too close. Her father remained stiff-torn between fury and the dawning realization that his control was slipping. It should have been vindicating, but instead it filled Ella with a complicated ache. These were the people she had once longed to impress, the ones whose approval had cost her pieces of herself. Now they revealed themselves as nothing more than actors willing to swap lines at the hint of fortune. She wanted to speak to expose them for what they were, but Luke's steady presence stopped her. He wasn't rushing, wasn't lashing out. He was waiting. She could feel it in the way his hand brushed hers under the table, grounding her. Something more was coming, something that would not simply turn whispers into silence, but shatter the facade completely. Luke straightened, then his voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. The conversations died down, heads turning, anticipation rising. Sophie's smile faltered. Her mother's hands stilled on her pearls, her father's jaw tightened. Luke looked around the room calm and unshaken before his gaze returned to Ella once more. And then he opened his mouth to say something that would freeze the entire wedding in its tracks. Luke let the silence gather until it was nearly unbearable. Every eye locked on him, every breath in the room held taut. Then he spoke, his voice steady and resonant, each word deliberate. "I kept it quiet," he said, his gaze sweeping the hall, but resting finally and firmly on Ella, to know who would love me without the acres, without the titles, without the numbers. His words dropped into the space like stones into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. Whispers rose and fell, but no one dared interrupt. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit and drew out something small, almost incongruous against the backdrop of chandeliers and diamonds. It was a seed cradled in a tiny glass vial. He held it up so the light caught its delicate form. "This," he said, "is from the first harvest after I rebuilt the farm. A single seed. It isn't worth anything to most of you, but to me it is everything, proof that life can grow again from nothing." He turned then, closing the distance between himself and Ella, who sat frozen at her place near the back. The crowd parted without being asked, instinctively making way. Luke stopped before her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Ella," he said softer now, though every ear strained to hear. "You loved me when I had nothing to offer but calloused hands and hope. You stood with me when it cost you the family you once called your own. Everything I am today, everything I've built, means nothing without you beside me." He held out the seed, his hand trembling just slightly, though his voice did not falter. "Will you keep building with me? Not because of acres or fortune, but because you are my home." A hush fell so profound that the air seemed to hum. Guests leaned forward, breaths caught, unable to tear their eyes from the scene. Ella's chest constricted, the humiliation of the evening, the years of rejection, the weight of her family's scorn, all of it collided with the depth of Luke's words. Tears pricked her eyes, but they were not of shame. They were born of recognition of being seen wholly and without condition. She rose slowly, her hands trembling, and placed her fingers over his. The seed was warm against her palm, its simplicity more precious than any jewel her family had ever dangled before her. She did not need to speak, but she did, her voice quiet yet steady. "Yes, Luke. Always yes." His hand extended then, an invitation, not just for this moment, but for every step to follow. She took it without hesitation, and together they turned, walking through the parted crowd. Not a word was exchanged among the guests. No laughter, no sneers, only silence, the kind that follows when power shifts and people are left struggling to comprehend it. As Ella and Luke crossed the ballroom past tables laden with untouched champagne and half-eaten delicacies, she felt the eyes of her family burning into her back. Her mother's mask of poise had cracked, her lips pressed into a thin line of disbelief. Sophie's face twisted with rage, envy flickering like a flame behind her eyes. Her father's hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that the veins bulged, his jaw clenched as though holding back a storm of words he dared not unleash in public. Ella held her head high, Luke's hand strong in hers, and for the first time she felt the weight of their disdain lift. It no longer mattered. Their approval was no longer the currency she needed. With Luke beside her, with the seed pressed into her palm, she had all the wealth she could ever want. The heavy doors closed behind them as they stepped out into the cool night air. The sounds of the party dimmed, replaced by the low hum of the jet still cooling on the field nearby. Ella inhaled deeply, the crisp air sharp and clean against her lungs, as if she had finally stepped out of a suffocating room into freedom. Luke squeezed her hand and she looked up at him, her heart swelling with something she had never felt so fiercely before: vindication. But even as relief washed over her, a shadow lingered at the edges of her thoughts. She had seen the fury in her father's eyes, the venom in Sophie's stare, the cold calculation behind her mother's forced smile. They would not let this humiliation stand. They would not allow her victory to go unanswered. As Luke guided her toward the waiting car, Ella knew the night was not an ending, but a beginning. Behind the silence of the ballroom, behind the fractured pride of her family, something darker was stirring. And she sensed with bone-deep certainty that the battle was far from over. When Ella and Luke stepped out of the ballroom, the night air felt like freedom. Yet before they could reach the waiting car, hurried footsteps followed them. Her mother's voice, too bright and too forced, cut through the cool evening. "Luke, Ella. Wait, please." They turned to see her parents approaching Sophie, a pace behind her face, pinched with frustration, but trying to mimic composure. Her mother clasped her hands together as if in prayer, her pearls trembling at her throat. "We've all had a terrible misunderstanding," she said with a thin laugh. "You know how families are. Things get twisted, words get said in the wrong spirit. But seeing you tonight, Luke, hearing your story, I can only say how proud we are to have you connected to our family." Her father stepped in. Then his earlier rage smoothed over with a mask of civility. His tone was firm, but falsely warm, the kind he used in boardrooms when sealing deals. "Yes, indeed. It seems we underestimated you, Luke. 17,000 acres agri. Next Forbes, quite the achievement. Any parent would be proud to see their daughter with such a man. We only worried she was wasting her potential, that's all. But clearly we misjudged. The important thing is that we move forward together. No need to dwell on the past." His hand extended stiffly as though the act alone erased years of venom. Ella stood frozen, her pulse quickening with every word. She had known they were capable of cruelty, but the swiftness of their transformation was almost grotesque. Moments ago, they had erased her existence with silence and insulted her with sneers. Now, because power had shifted, they wrapped themselves in honeyed words, rewriting history as though their betrayal had never happened. Sophie chimed in with saccharine sweetness, her tone dripping with false sisterly affection. "Yes, Ella, we should celebrate. We're family after all. And Luke, I think we have so much in common. You must let us host you for dinner soon. Imagine what we could achieve if we worked together." Luke listened without interruption, his expression courteous but distant. When her father's hand lingered between them, Luke did not take it. Instead, he inclined his head, his voice calm and precise. "I appreciate your words, but I don't confuse politeness with truth. Tonight has shown me enough." He shifted his gaze toward Ella briefly, the faintest softness breaking his composure before returning to her parents. "You treated your own daughter as less than nothing until you discovered she had something you wanted. That's not family, that's transaction. And I am not interested in business of that kind." The words landed like a slap, though his tone never rose. Her mother flushed, stammering, "Luke, you misunderstand," but he cut her off with a quiet firmness. "No, I don't. I've spent a lifetime learning the difference between people who value me for what I have and those who value me for who I am. Ella chose me when I had nothing. That's all that matters." He reached for Ella's hand, then not as a show, but as a truth too plain to deny. His grip was steady, anchoring her even as her chest ached with the collision of pride and sorrow. Ella's eyes swept over her family, searching for even a flicker of sincerity. But what she saw was not remorse. It was calculation. Her father's jaw twitched with irritation at being denied. Her mother's eyes darted as though seeking a new angle. Sophie's smile strained, but still angled toward Luke like a weapon. They were not humbled. They were strategizing already, bending themselves into shapes that might yet reclaim what they thought they had lost. And in that moment, Ella understood something that pierced deeper than all the insults. They had never loved her for herself. They had loved the version of her that could bring them status that reflected their own power. When she chose Luke, when she chose soil and sweat and authenticity, she had ceased to be useful. Their cruelty had not been born of anger, but of dismissal. And now, seeing Luke's empire, they crawled back not because they cared for her, but because they saw value again. The realization struck like a final blow. She felt the years of yearning for their acceptance collapse into dust. She no longer craved it. She no longer believed it was possible. Their warmth was a mask, and tonight it had slipped enough for her to see the truth. Luke guided her toward the car, but Ella turned once more to face them. "You don't get to rewrite what you did," she said quietly. "Not tonight. Not ever." Her voice trembled with emotion, but the conviction was steel. Her mother's face tightened. Her father's mouth opened as if to retort, but no words came. Sophie only glared, her mask cracking just enough to reveal the envy beneath. Ella climbed into the car beside Luke, her chest heavy but her spirit unshaken. As the door shut and the world outside dimmed, she felt his hand close over hers once more. For the first time, she realized she didn't need their love to survive. She had her own, and it was enough. But as the car pulled away, her phone buzzed in her bag. She hesitated, then glanced at the screen. A name she hadn't seen in years flashed across the display: Daniel, the boy she had loved in college, the one who vanished without explanation. Her breath caught memories flooding back. Why now? Why after all these years? And with that message waiting, she knew the night's revelations were far from over. A deeper secret was about to unravel, one that would force her to see just how far her family's manipulation had gone. The car hummed softly as it carried them away from the glittering hall, but Ella sat rigid, her phone still heavy in her hand, Daniel's name glowing on the screen before she turned it face down. Her heart hammered with a mix of confusion and dread, and Luke, sensing her turmoil, reached across to steady her hand. He didn't ask her to explain the message. Instead, his voice was low, deliberate, and filled with something heavier than jealousy. "There's something I've kept from you, Ella. I thought I was sparing you, but after tonight you deserve the truth." She turned toward him, her breath shallow. Luke's eyes didn't waver as he spoke. "Your father. He didn't just disapprove of Daniel. He destroyed him. I heard it years ago from a man who once worked for your family's firm. Your father paid someone to set Daniel up. Falsified accusations. Financial trouble. Things that could have ruined him before he even started his career. Daniel left you because he thought staying would cost you everything. He never stopped caring. He was pushed out." Ella's stomach twisted, her hand clutching at the fabric of her dress. Memories rushed back, the sudden silence in Daniel's calls. The unanswered letters, the way he vanished from her life like a ghost. She had blamed herself, convinced she hadn't been enough. For years, she had carried the ache of abandonment, burying it beneath her father's reassurances that Daniel wasn't suitable, that he lacked ambition. To hear now that it had been a lie, an orchestrated betrayal, split something open inside her. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, the city lights blurring past in streaks of color. "I thought he didn't love me enough to fight," she whispered more to herself than to Luke. "All this time I thought I wasn't worth staying for." Her throat tightened, tears spilling despite her attempt to hold them back. And it was him, my own father. He stole it from me. Luke's hand tightened gently around hers. "He's stolen more than that. Your dreams, your choices. I've seen it in the way you hesitate sometimes, as if you're still waiting for permission to breathe. Ella, you've been caged your whole life. They built those walls so carefully, you didn't even notice until you tried to leave." Her mind reeled back to the countless moments that now glowed with a cruel clarity. The art supplies she had begged to keep as a child tossed away because painting was a hobby, not a legacy. The university program in Florence she had been accepted into abandoned after her father said Europe was for idle dreamers. Even the way her mother had measured her dresses, her posture, her smile, always reminding her that perfection wasn't for her but for the image of the family. Every step, every choice molded and pruned until she could barely tell where she ended and their ambitions began. The truth was suffocating, but it was also freeing in its rawness. For the first time she saw the bars clearly, the patterns of control and the ways she had been bent to fit a mold. Her chest ached. Her hands trembled, but a small fierce spark lit within her. She had survived their abandonment, their cruelty. She had built a life with Luke from soil and sweat, not because they allowed it, but because she claimed it. She turned back to Luke, her voice hoarse but firm. "He took Daniel from me. He tried to take you too. How much more of my life was ever mine?" Luke's expression softened. Sorrow threading through his strength. "Enough that you chose differently when it mattered. That's what they'll never forgive. You proved their control wasn't absolute." Ella let his words settle, though the ache of old wounds pulsed deeper now than ever. She thought of Daniel not with longing but with a mourning for what had been stolen. Not just him, but the girl she had been hopeful and unguarded, who believed love alone could withstand anything. That girl had been silenced by her father's manipulations, reshaped by her mother's demands, overshadowed by Sophie's golden child role. But tonight, the truth stripped away their illusions. She was no longer that girl, and she would never be again. The car slowed as they reached their hotel, and Ella stepped out feeling unsteady but clearer than she had in years. The night air bit at her skin, sharp and grounding. She turned to Luke, gratitude and anguish warring in her chest. Before she could speak, a voice called her name from across the lobby. She froze. Rachel, her cousin, stood there clutching a folder against her chest, her face pale but determined. Ella blinked, taken aback by the urgency in her eyes. Rachel stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I know what they did to you. I have proof more than you realize. It's not just Daniel. It's bigger. Much bigger." She held the folder tighter as though inside it lay the weight of generations. Ella's pulse spiked, the anger and grief of the night funneling into sharp focus. Whatever Rachel carried, it wasn't gossip or rumor. It was something that could tip the scales, something that could break the mask of her family once and for all. And Ella knew as she reached for the folder that the war she thought she'd already fought was only beginning. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she pressed the folder into Ella's grasp, but her eyes held steady, burning with a conviction Ella had never seen in her before. They sat together in the quiet of the hotel lounge, the echoes of the wedding still faint in the distance, muffled laughter and music filtering through heavy walls. Luke kept a protective presence nearby, silent but watchful, while Ella opened the folder and began to sift through the papers within. What she saw made her stomach clench. Bank statements, charitable foundation reports, wire transfers that circled back to accounts under shell companies. On the surface, her parents' charity appeared legitimate, raising funds for education programs in underprivileged communities. But the numbers told another story. Vast sums were siphoned into private accounts investments disguised as philanthropy, entire schools that existed only on paper. Ella's hands shook as she flipped page after page, her breath catching. This wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. Rachel leaned forward, her voice low but urgent. "I've been gathering this for months. I knew something was wrong when I was asked to help with the foundation's bookkeeping. They gave me small tasks thinking I wasn't smart enough to notice, but I kept copies. I tracked the trails. They've been using charity to launder money, Ella. And everyone in our family has turned a blind eye." Ella lifted her gaze, shock and fury battling in her chest. "Why are you showing me this now? Why me?" Rachel swallowed her throat tight. "Because you're the only one who's ever stood against them. I used to envy you for it. You walked away when the rest of us were too afraid. They mocked me too, said I wasn't polished enough, not smart enough, not beautiful enough to matter. I've lived in their shadow my whole life. But you?" Her eyes glistened. "You had the courage I never did. I admired you for that." The admission pierced Ella's heart more deeply than the documents in her hands. For years she had felt utterly alone in her rebellion, convinced that her choice to leave had marked her as foolish, selfish, a failure. Now, hearing Rachel's voice tremble with sincerity, she realized that her act of defiance had been a beacon, however dim, for someone else trapped in the same cage. She reached across the table, placing her hand over Rachel's. "You matter, Rachel, more than they'll ever admit, and you're stronger than you think. You proved it by holding on to this." Luke's voice finally broke the silence, calm but edged with steel. "This is enough to destroy them publicly, not just socially, legally." He tapped the folder with one long finger. "But it has to be used carefully. If you strike without precision, they'll bury it, spin it, maybe even frame someone else. We need timing. We need leverage." Ella nodded, her mind already turning. She had come to the wedding expecting only to endure humiliation, but now, for the first time, she saw a path not just to survival, but to justice. She and Rachel could be allies, two women long dismissed, underestimated, bound by scars inflicted by the same hands. Together, they could drag the truth into the light. Rachel's face shifted determination, replacing fear. "I don't want to run anymore. I want them to answer for everything they've done." Ella looked at her cousin, then at Luke, and felt something steady take root inside her. This wasn't just about personal vengeance anymore. It was about exposing a rot that had spread through generations, about making sure no one else fell victim to the same lies and manipulations. The three of them leaned close, their voices low, mapping out possibilities. Luke would use his resources discreetly to verify the evidence to ensure no one could claim it was fabricated. Rachel would keep digging for the threads she still had access to. Ella would decide the moment the strike that would wound not only their reputation, but their carefully curated empire. For the first time, she felt not like the outcast, but the center of a movement, the fulcrum around which justice could turn. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. They were preparing for war, but not with weapons her family understood. They would fight with truth, with proof, with exposure. The same spotlight her parents had always craved would become the fire that burned them. As Rachel tucked stray papers back into the folder, the sound of voices carried down the hall. Guests were leaving the ballroom, conversations heated, strained, and then a sharper tone cut through the voice of the groom himself. Ella stilled, straining to hear. His words were low, urgent, but clear enough to reach them. "I can't do this, Sophie. Not after what I've just learned about you." The color drained from Rachel's face. Ella sat frozen, the folder clutched tightly in her lap. Whatever was about to unfold, it wouldn't just crack the veneer of her parents' empire. It would tear Sophie's perfect wedding apart, and with it, the fragile image their family had worked so ruthlessly to protect. The ground beneath them was shifting faster than Ella had ever dared hope. The tension in the ballroom had already shifted into a nervous current after Luke's revelation, but when the groom's voice cut through sharp with anger, it was as if every sound drained out of the room at once. He stood rigid in the center of the floor, his face pale, his fists clenched at his sides. Sophie hovered near him, her smile faltering, her eyes darting toward her parents as though they might script her next move. "I can't believe I'm saying this in front of everyone." The groom began, his voice low but trembling with rage. "But I won't stand here pretending anymore. Sophie, you disgust me." A collective gasp rolled through the guests. Sophie's lips parted, her hand rising as if to shush him, but he shook her off violently. Don't you dare touch me. I've kept my mouth shut for weeks, hoping I could forget, hoping I was wrong. But tonight I finally have the courage to say it out loud. You went after another man, not just any man, him." Every head turned toward Luke, who stood tall and silent, his expression unreadable. Ella felt the world tilt beneath her feet, heat rushing into her cheeks. She looked at Luke instinctively, searching his face for denial, for anger, for something. But he did not flinch. He simply met her gaze with steady calm, a quiet plea for trust shimmering in his eyes. The groom's words grew harsher, tumbling out in broken bursts. "You sent him messages, pictures, begging for his attention. My fiancé crawling at the feet of my own cousin's husband, because you found out he wasn't just some farmer, but a man worth more than I'll ever be. I saw the emails, Sophie. I saw the photos. Don't you dare deny it! A shocked murmur broke through the crowd. Women covered their mouths. Men muttered curses. The musicians lowered their instruments. The ballroom became a cauldron of whispers and wide-eyed stares. Sophie's face went crimson, her composure unraveling as she sputtered, "That's not true. You don't understand." It was nothing but her voice cracked under the weight of disbelief circling her like vultures. Her mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Her father's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with fury not at the sin, but at the exposure. And Ella stood frozen, her hands trembling, her heart aching with both shame and fury. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but Luke's stillness anchored her. He had known. He had borne the knowledge in silence to protect her from this moment. And now, with everything laid bare, he refused to strike back, his restraint more powerful than any defense. The groom turned to the crowd, his voice rising with bitter clarity. "You all came here to celebrate a union built on lies. Well, I won't play the fool any longer. The wedding is off. Consider this her true unveiling." With that, he ripped the ring from his finger and hurled it to the ground, the sound of metal striking marble echoing like a final gavel. Gasps gave way to chaos, guests shifting, whispering, phones appearing in hands to capture the spectacle. Sophie crumpled into a chair, her mascara streaking down her cheeks, her sobs high and desperate. Her parents rushed to her side, but their soothing words rang hollow in the thick air of disgrace. The illusion of perfection crafted with such ruthless precision had shattered into shards before 200 witnesses. Ella felt Luke's hand brush against hers, grounding her again. She turned to him, and he leaned close, his voice a whisper meant only for her. "Let them burn in their own fire. We don't need to stay here a second longer." Together they stepped forward, drawing every gaze as they crossed the ruined hall. The guests parted as though commanded, eyes wide, murmurs swelling. Ella kept her chin high, each step stripping away years of humiliation. When they reached the door, she stopped and turned, her voice carrying above the chaos. "You called me a barn wife," she said, her tone clear and cutting, "but tonight proves where the rot really lies. Not in barns, not in soil. It's in the heart of this family where love was always conditional and loyalty was always for sale." The words hung heavy, slicing through the noise until silence rippled out once more. Her father's face twisted with rage, her mother's tears sparkled under the light, and Sophie buried her face in her hands. Ella turned away, then her hand tight in Luke's, and together they walked into the night. But as the doors shut behind them, Ella knew this was not an ending. Her family's shame was raw and public, but they would not surrender quietly. There would be consequences, and she would be ready to face them, no matter how far they reached. The ballroom doors closed behind them with a muted thud, shutting out the chaos they left in their wake. Ella's heels clicked softly against the marble floor of the empty corridor as Luke guided her forward, his hand warm and steady in hers. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence felt sacred, as though words would cheapen the gravity of what had just unfolded. For years, Ella had imagined confronting her family, delivering the perfect retort, reclaiming her dignity in a storm of triumph. Yet now, with the taste of victory fresh on her tongue, she found herself strangely unburdened instead of triumphant. Luke squeezed her hand gently, his presence anchoring her as her breath finally slowed. They reached the grand staircase, its gilded railings gleaming in the soft light, and paused. Ella glanced back over her shoulder. Through the doors she could still hear faint echoes, raised voices, gasps, the unmistakable chaos of something breaking apart. Guests were leaving in clusters, their whispers carrying like shards of glass. Sophie's sobs cut through the noise, shrill and broken, while their parents' attempts to hush the scandal only seemed to fuel it further. Ella inhaled deeply, the air cool and refreshing against her lungs after the stifling weight of that ballroom. She leaned closer to Luke, her lips brushing near his ear as she whispered, "I thought I'd feel victorious, but I just feel free." The words surprised even her, but as soon as they were spoken, she knew they were true. It wasn't revenge that filled her chest with warmth, it was release. She had carried the burden of her family's expectations, their disdain, their manipulations for so long that she had forgotten what life without it might feel like. And now, standing at the edge of their crumbling empire, she felt lighter than she ever had before. Luke turned to her, his eyes soft with understanding. "Freedom is the greatest victory, Ella. They can't touch you anymore, not where it matters." His voice was quiet, but the conviction behind it made her heart ache in a new way, not from pain, but from gratitude. She smiled faintly, letting the truth of his words seep into her bones. As they descended the stairs together, hand in hand, guests scattered around the lobby, their eyes darting between curiosity and discomfort. No one dared approach. Ella walked tall, her shoulders back, her chin high, no longer the outcast to be pitied or mocked, but the woman who had walked away with dignity intact. Luke's presence beside her, steady and unflinching, was proof that she had chosen love over status, truth over appearances, and won. Outside, the night was alive with a crisp breeze that swept away the lingering scent of champagne and wilted flowers. The luxury cars lined up along the curb gleamed under the street lamps, but it was the dark stretch of sky above that drew Ella's eyes. She felt as though the stars themselves were bearing witness to the unraveling of her old life and the quiet beginning of something new. Behind them, the wedding was already disintegrating into whispers that would echo through society columns and boardrooms. The perfect family image her parents had cultivated for decades was crumbling, not with a bang, but with the suffocating silence of truth revealed. Ella could imagine it, her mother clutching Sophie's arm trying to salvage what little composure remained. Her father barking orders that fell on deaf ears. Sophie shrinking under the stares of once adoring guests who now saw her for what she was. The empire of appearances they had built was dissolving in real time, and Ella hadn't lifted a finger. She didn't need to. The truth had done all the work. She and Luke slipped into their waiting car, the driver closing the door with a soft click that sealed them into a bubble of calm. Ella rested her head against the seat, her hands still clasped tightly in Luke's. For a long while they sat in silence, both lost in their thoughts. Ella's mind replayed the night's events in flashes, the sting of being called barn wife, the humiliation of her assigned seat by the restroom, the explosion of scandal that ended in Sophie's ruin. Yet none of it haunted her. Instead, each memory now felt like another chain broken, another weight lifted. As the car pulled away from the curb, Ella finally exhaled. She turned to Luke, her eyes searching his profile, etched with strength and patience. "How do you always stay so calm?" she asked softly. Even when everything is collapsing, Luke's lips curved into the faintest smile, his gaze fixed on the passing lights outside. "Because I've lived through worse collapses. What happened tonight is nothing compared to what I've built and what I still need to show you." There was something in his tone, measured, almost cryptic, that stirred Ella's curiosity. She straightened slightly, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Luke glanced at her, then his eyes holding secrets she hadn't yet uncovered. "You've seen glimpses of what I've done, Ella. The land, the company, the work. But you don't yet understand the scope of it. Everything you saw tonight, the helicopter, the acres, the name in Forbes, that was only the surface. Tomorrow I'll take you deeper. I want you to know the full truth of the life we've built together, the life we're still building." Ella's heart skipped, anticipation sparking in her chest. She thought she had already seen the enormity of Luke's world, but the certainty in his voice told her there was far more waiting to be revealed. She turned her gaze to the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks as the car sped forward. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking back. She was leaning into what lay ahead, into a future that promised not just love, but power, legacy, and truth. The ballroom and its wreckage faded behind them, swallowed by the night. Ahead, a horizon of secrets waited, and Ella knew she was finally ready to face them. The morning after the disastrous wedding, Ella awoke with a curious mix of calm and anticipation. The storm of the previous night had passed, and for the first time in years, she felt untethered from her family's grip. Luke had promised to show her the full scope of his work, and she sensed that what she had seen so far was only the surface of something vast. She dressed simply, leaving behind the gown that had been chosen for her humiliation, and followed Luke as he drove them out of the city and toward the countryside. Hours later, the skyline gave way to rolling fields, but this was no ordinary farmland. Ahead, sleek glass buildings rose in harmony with greenhouses and wind turbines, their clean lines glinting beneath the sun. The entrance bore the discreet but powerful insignia of Reynolds Agricultural Group. Ella stepped out of the car and felt her breath catch. This wasn't the rustic farmstead she had first known. It was an empire built not only on soil, but on vision. Inside the facility buzzed with energy. Young engineers in lab coats carried trays of seedlings into climate-controlled chambers. Drones hovered in testing bays, their frames gleaming as they were prepared for deployment in vast fields. Data screens lined the walls, tracking soil health, water usage, and crop yields in real time. It was a fusion of earth and technology that felt almost futuristic. Ella walked slowly, absorbing it all, her heels clicking softly against polished concrete. She had spent her life designing interiors meant to impress, but this space impressed in a way no penthouse ever could. This wasn't about appearances, it was about transformation. Luke guided her through, his voice steady, but filled with quiet pride. He explained how their systems used AI to predict weather patterns, how soil sensors reduced waste, how their practices had cut water use by 40% while boosting harvests. The world thinks farming is about grit and guesswork, he said, but the future is precision. We're not just feeding people, we're changing how food is grown, how land is valued, how communities survive. Ella listened, a swell of admiration rising within her. She had always loved Luke for his humility, for the man who worked the earth with his hands. But seeing him here speaking with authority about technology and sustainability, she realized he was far more than a farmer. He was a pioneer standing at the crossroads of tradition and innovation, shaping the future in ways most people couldn't even imagine. Their tour ended in a greenhouse warm and fragrant, with rows of tomato vines stretching toward the light. Yet amid the promise of growth, Ella sensed a tension in the air. She noticed a group of managers gathered around a table, their faces grim. Luke approached them, and one of the men handed him a tablet. Ella watched his brow furrow as he scanned the data. "What happened?" she asked quietly when he returned to her side. "One of our projects failed." Luke admitted, his voice even. "A new irrigation system we've been piloting. It didn't hold up under stress testing. We've invested heavily, and the setback could delay production for months." His tone carried no panic, but Ella saw the weight in his shoulders. For a moment, she felt the old urge to retreat, to let someone else fix the problem the way she had been conditioned in her family's world. But then she stepped forward, her designer's eye catching something the engineers hadn't. What if the problem isn't the system itself, but the layout she suggested? She sketched quickly in the dirt with her finger, reconfiguring the rows to allow for more efficient water flow. "You're thinking in terms of machinery, but what if you treated it like space design? Water needs paths just like people do." Luke stared at her drawing, then at her, his eyes alight with surprise. "That's brilliant," he said softly. "Sometimes it takes a fresh eye to see the simplest solution." For the first time, Ella felt herself not just as an observer, but as a partner. The realization stirred something deep inside her, a sense of belonging she had never felt in her family's world of titles and wealth. Here, her ideas mattered. Here, she could build, contribute, and be valued for her mind as well as her heart. As they left the greenhouse, Luke's hand lingered at her back, guiding her gently forward. His pride was not only in his empire, but in her place within it. Ella felt her admiration deepen, not only for the man who had defended her at the wedding, but for the visionary who had built something that could outlast generations. By the time evening fell, the sun casting a golden glow across the fields, Ella was overwhelmed not by the size of Luke's empire, but by the depth of his purpose. They returned to the farmhouse where a table had been set outside, beneath strings of soft lights. Candles flickered against the dusk, and the scent of lavender drifted from the garden. It was simple, yet intentional, a space crafted not for grandeur, but for intimacy. Luke pulled out a chair for her, his eyes searching hers with a quiet intensity that made her heart skip. Ella realized with sudden clarity that this night would not be like any other. It wasn't about land or power or revenge. It was about something more timeless. A moment that could redefine not just their love, but the life they would build together. And as the first stars appeared overhead, she knew that the night ahead carried a weight she had only begun to understand. The soft glow of the string lights cast a golden shimmer across the farmhouse yard, and the night sky above stretched endlessly dotted with stars that seemed to pulse with quiet anticipation. Ella sat across from Luke at the table he had prepared, the candles flickering gently between them. There was no music, no audience, only the hum of the crickets in the grass and the faint rustle of wind through the fields. After everything that had unfolded, the humiliation, the revelations, the collapse of her family's facade, this moment felt almost surreal. It was too simple, too pure, and yet it carried more weight than all the glittering banquets she had ever endured. Luke rose from his chair slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached into his pocket, but instead of the grand velvet box Ella might have expected, he held something small and unpolished. A silver ring, simple but shining, clearly worn smooth, from being carried for a long time. He stepped around the table until he stood in front of her, the candlelight reflecting in his steady gaze. "Ella," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "The first time I asked you to marry me, I had nothing but a farm, calloused hands, and a hope that love was enough. You said yes then, not because of what I could give you, but because of who I was. Tonight I ask again, not as a farmer trying to prove himself, but as a man who has built something worth sharing. I don't just want you as my wife. I want you as my partner in every sense, equal, trusted, and essential to the future we'll create." Tears pricked Ella's eyes as he knelt, not in grand spectacle, but in humble reverence. She felt the weight of his words, words that carried not only love, but respect, the one thing her family had always withheld from her. He extended the ring, waiting, not rushing, as though he wanted her to feel the depth of his sincerity. Ella's throat tightened as she whispered, "Yes, Luke. 1,000 times yes." She slipped the ring onto her finger, its plainness more beautiful than any jewel her parents had ever demanded she wear. It wasn't about display. It was about promise. Luke pulled her into his arms, and for a long moment they stood under the stars, the earth solid beneath their feet, the future stretching wide before them. When they finally returned to their seats, the conversation shifted from romance to vision. Ella leaned forward, her hands animated as she spoke of ideas she had been carrying quietly, thoughts about design, sustainability, and community. Luke listened intently, nodding, asking questions, treating every word she spoke as though it mattered deeply. It struck her then that this was what true partnership felt like, being not only heard, but valued. Within weeks, their bond transformed into action. Together, they announced the launch of a scholarship fund dedicated to young women pursuing agricultural sciences and technology. The fund bore the name of Luke's late mother, a woman who had worked the land with resilience and grace, but had never been given the recognition she deserved. At the press conference, Ella stood proudly beside Luke as he spoke of honoring his mother's legacy, of opening doors for women who would change the future of farming. When Ella took the podium, she spoke of her own journey of being dismissed and underestimated, and of how education had the power to free women from cages built by others. The audience responded with thunderous applause, not because she was flawless, but because she was real. The scholarship quickly gained traction, drawing attention from universities, nonprofits, and even policymakers. Donations poured in, inspired by the combination of Luke's vision and Ella's authenticity. For the first time, Ella felt herself not as the daughter who had disappointed her family, but as a woman shaping a legacy alongside the man she loved. Every press clipping, every letter of thanks from a student was proof that they were building something that would last beyond themselves. Yet amid the triumph, a shadow remained at the edges of Ella's thoughts. She knew her family would not vanish quietly. Their power had been shaken, their reputation fractured, but they were cunning and relentless. It was only a matter of time before they tried to claw back some semblance of control. Her suspicion was confirmed one quiet afternoon when Rachel appeared at the farmhouse once more. She carried a slim envelope, her expression grave. "I wasn't sure if I should give this to you," she admitted, her voice low, "but you deserve to know. This could change everything." She placed the envelope in Ella's hands. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size, as though the paper contained a storm waiting to be unleashed. Ella looked down, her pulse quickening as possibilities surged through her mind. The scholarships, the farm, her life with Luke, these were her future. But whatever lay sealed in this envelope was tied to her past, a past that refused to stay buried. She glanced at Luke, his steady eyes urging her to be strong. She inhaled deeply, bracing herself. The time for freedom had come, but perhaps so had the time for final reckoning. Ella carried the envelope upstairs to Luke's office, her fingers trembling as though the weight of it might burn through her skin. The farmhouse was quiet, Rachel having left with only a whispered plea for Ella to look closely before deciding what to do. Luke followed silently, giving her space, but staying near his presence steady. She spread the papers across the wide oak desk, the lamplight throwing sharp shadows over the black ink and neat columns of numbers. The first pages were financial statements from the family's foundation. To the public, it was a charity lauded for its efforts in education and housing. To the trained eye, the figures told another story. Ella had grown up watching her father manage accounts at the dinner table, listening to the cadence of numbers, the way he twisted them into narratives that served him. Tonight she felt that same sick rhythm echoing through these papers. Huge donations appeared to flow into scholarships, but the funds were rerouted through shell companies, then quietly siphoned back into her parents' private accounts. The charity wasn't charity at all, it was a front, a gleaming mask for theft. She felt nausea rise, but she forced herself to keep reading. And then she noticed it, a single line in one ledger, a date that didn't match an entry, shifted by a day that shouldn't have been possible. To anyone else it was a clerical mistake, but Ella knew better. That day she had been at a gala where her father had boasted about the record-breaking funds raised. She remembered the check presented on stage with cameras flashing. Yet here in black and white was the proof that the check had never gone to the school. It had vanished, swallowed into a numbered account overseas. Her pulse raced. For the first time she felt not like a bystander to her family's corruption, but an active witness. She had found the crack in the facade herself. "Luke," she whispered, her voice tight. "This is the piece they can't explain away. It's not just unethical, it's fraud with evidence. They forged entire records to hide it." Luke's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "Then we have enough. We'll bring in a lawyer, someone who can build the case properly. But Ella," his voice softened, "it has to be your choice. This isn't just business. This is family. If we move forward, there's no going back. They'll face prison, disgrace, ruin. Or you can bury it and keep living free without dragging it all into the light. It's your call." The room felt colder as his words settled in. Ella sank into the chair, her eyes fixed on the damning pages spread before her. For so long she had dreamed of this moment, of having the power to strike back, to hold them accountable for the years of cruelty and manipulation. And yet, staring at the papers, she felt a hollow ache in her chest. These weren't just numbers and signatures. They were a map of her family's soul, every line another proof that their love had always been transactional, their care a performance. Her mind drifted back unbidden to the moments when she had been just a girl. She remembered her father's heavy hand on her shoulder as he steered her away from her easel, insisting that painting was frivolous. She remembered her mother's voice, sharp as glass, telling her to sit straighter, smile brighter, never embarrass them. Even the rare evenings of warmth, her mother brushing her hair by the fire, now seemed tinged with calculation. Was it comfort, or training for a role she had never wanted to play? And beneath it all, one memory rose like a tide. She was 6, standing in her mother's study, clutching a drawing she had made of their house. crayon lines crooked and messy but filled with pride. Her mother had smiled faintly, then folded the paper in half and tucked it in a drawer. "Not now, Ella. Someday you'll understand we don't waste time on silly things." For years, Ella had told herself it was a misunderstanding. But now, looking at the proof of lies and theft before her, she wondered if that dismissal had been the truest glimpse of who her mother really was. Luke's voice broke gently through her reverie. "You don't owe them protection anymore. But you do owe yourself peace. Whatever you decide, I'll stand with you." His words wrapped around her like a shield, but they could not quiet the storm inside her. She wanted justice. She wanted freedom. But as her fingers traced the line of fraudulent numbers, she felt the tug of a memory too old and too tender to dismiss. Somewhere beneath the anger, there was still the ache of a child who had once believed her parents could love her unconditionally. Ella closed her eyes, the papers rustling softly under her hand. The choice was clear, yet her heart wavered. Because just when she thought she had escaped every chain, a single memory from childhood pulled her back into doubt. Ella sat in the quiet of Luke's office long after the lamp had burned low, the incriminating papers still spread across the desk like an open wound. She tried to let the numbers speak for themselves, to focus on the neat lines of fraud and forgery, but her mind drifted unbidden to a softer place. A memory she had long tucked away came to her with surprising clarity, the sound of her mother's voice humming faintly, the scratch of a pencil on paper, and her small hands trying to imitate graceful strokes. She had been no more than 7, sitting at the kitchen table while her mother for once had time to spare. Instead of brushing her off, she had placed her hand gently over Ella's and guided the pencil into a curve. Like this, her mother had set her tone patient, almost tender. For a few rare afternoons that year they had drawn together. Flowers, houses, even a clumsy attempt at a horse. It had felt like love, then pure and uncomplicated. The recollection warmed her for a moment before the present snapped it away, because that tenderness had never lasted. By the following season, her mother had dismissed art as childish distraction, replacing sketchbooks with etiquette lessons, the gentle humming with sharp corrections about posture and diction. The memory of being guided in love had always been overshadowed by years of being steered in control. Sitting in the lamplight, Ella felt the ache of longing for what those early days had promised, but never delivered. She pushed back from the desk, pacing the room as her emotions tangled. Part of her wanted to cling to that memory, to believe there had once been something real beneath her mother's rigid mask. But the rest of her, the woman who had endured sneers, manipulations, and outright betrayals, knew better. Her parents had never once come to her with true remorse. They had never admitted their cruelty, never asked for forgiveness. Their only apologies had been laced with excuses, their only kindness calculated for advantage. They had not loved her, as she was only as they wanted her to be. Luke entered quietly, leaning against the doorframe as he watched her wrestle with herself. He didn't interrupt, but his silence urged her to speak. "I keep remembering," she said finally, her voice rough. "There were moments, tiny fleeting moments, when I thought they loved me. When she held my hand and taught me to draw, I believed it. But it wasn't real, not really. Because if it had been, it wouldn't have vanished the moment I stopped fitting their plan. If they had truly loved me, they would have seen me even when I wasn't perfect." Her voice broke and she pressed her palms against her eyes, furious at herself for still bleeding over people who had never cared enough to heal her wounds. Luke crossed the room and placed his hands on her shoulders, steady and warm. "You don't have to forgive them," he said gently. "Not for what they've done, not for what they've stolen. But you can decide how to answer it. Justice doesn't have to be vengeance, Ella. It can be truth." She drew in a long, shaky breath, letting his words settle inside her. The idea of dragging them through court, watching them face handcuffs and prison cells, was tempting. She imagined the headlines, the public disgrace. Yet another part of her recoiled at the thought, not out of mercy for them, but for herself. Prison would make them martyrs in their own minds, victims of her cruelty. It would keep her bound to them, fighting endless battles in legal halls. What she wanted was not to tether herself to their downfall, but to sever herself from them completely. Slowly, clarity began to form. "They don't need jail," she said, her voice steadier now. "But their reputation will pay. That's all they ever cared about. The image, the illusion of respectability. Let the world see them as they are. Let every mask shatter." She looked down at the papers, the ledger lines that told the story of theft dressed as virtue. "We'll make the truth louder than their lies. That's punishment enough." Luke's eyes softened, pride and sorrow mingling as he nodded. "Then that's what we'll do. Not for revenge, but for freedom. For you." Ella exhaled deeply, as though the decision itself lifted a stone from her chest. She wasn't choosing forgiveness, but she wasn't choosing chains of bitterness either. She was choosing exposure, the light of truth burning away the shadows her family had hidden behind. For the first time, she felt that her story wasn't about their power anymore. It was about hers. Rachel returned the following day, and Ella told her of the decision. Relief flashed across her cousin's face, mingled with fierce determination. Together with Luke's guidance, they began to plan the next step, not courtrooms, but cameras. Not indictments, but headlines. They would dismantle her parents' empire in the court of public opinion, where no bribed lawyer or polished lie could shield them. The days that followed were a blur of preparation, gathering documents, drafting statements, arranging the press. Ella stood in the middle of it all, steady in her choice, even as the weight of what was coming pressed heavily on her shoulders. At night, she still remembered her mother's hand guiding hers across the page, but now the memory no longer swayed her. It was only a reminder of what could have been and what never was. The morning of the press conference arrived crisp and clear, the farmhouse buzzing with quiet urgency. Ella stood before the mirror, adjusting the simple blazer she had chosen. No pearls, no designer labels, nothing of her family's trappings. Only herself, plain and unadorned, carrying the truth in her hands. Luke entered behind her, his reflection steady at her side. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. She met her own eyes in the glass and nodded. "I'm ready." Outside, cameras waited, reporters gathered like vultures sensing a storm. And Ella stepped forward, knowing that with her words the world would finally see her parents not as pillars of society, but as the frauds they had always been. The conference hall in downtown Manhattan buzzed with the restless energy of anticipation. Every major outlet had sent their best reporters, their cameras poised on tripods, their microphones bristling across the stage. Luke had chosen this location, carefully neutral ground, but grand enough to command attention. The press release had promised a significant philanthropic announcement, and speculation swirled in hushed conversations among the journalists. They expected a wealthy businessman to unveil a scholarship fund, not the dramatic unmasking of an empire. Ella sat beside Luke at the long table draped in navy cloth, her fingers intertwined tightly in her lap. She had spoken before crowds many times, but never with stakes like these. Behind them, a banner displayed the name of the scholarship foundation, the Marion Reynolds Fund, honoring Luke's late mother. It was an image of legitimacy and hope, a contrast sharp enough to cut against what would follow. When Luke stood, the room quieted. His presence filled the space, commanding without force. "We are here today." He began to honor a woman who believed that every young girl deserves the chance to shape the world, no matter where she comes from. "My mother tilled the soil with her hands, and she taught me that strength and dignity often grow in silence. To carry that legacy forward, Ella and I are establishing the Marion Reynolds Fund for Women in Agriculture. This scholarship will empower young women to enter a field too long closed to them." Applause rippled, warm and sincere. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled. But Luke lifted a hand, and the room hushed once more. "That is not all," he said, his tone shifting. The timbre of his voice grew harder, cutting through the air. "Because it is impossible to celebrate true philanthropy without confronting falsehoods that corrupt it. Too many have built their reputations on the suffering of others, hiding theft behind the mask of charity." At his signal, a screen lit up behind him. Charts, documents, and bank records appeared in sequence, projected in stark detail. A man in a tailored suit, introduced as the head of an independent investigative firm, took the podium. His voice was calm, clinical, but each word struck like a hammer. Over the last decade, the Whitmore Foundation, managed by Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, has funneled millions of dollars in donations not to schools or housing projects as claimed, but into private accounts and offshore holdings. The evidence is indisputable. They presented themselves as philanthropists. But we present them to you now as frauds. Gasps rippled through the audience. Headlines were already being drafted in reporters' minds. On the screen, the phrase appeared in bold, "The faux philanthropists." The label was brutal, simple, unforgettable. Ella felt her heart pound as she scanned the faces in the crowd. Shock, curiosity, even anger reflected back at her. And then, in the second row, she saw her. A girl of maybe 19 sitting stiffly clutching a notebook. Her hair was pulled back too tight, her blazer too stiff for her frame. Ella knew that posture, that attempt to fit into a mold that never fit. The girl's wide eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, and Ella recognized the expression, the same mixture of longing and suffocation she had once carried as a teenager. It was like looking into a mirror of her younger self, silent and small, desperate to be enough. Something inside Ella hardened. She had doubted whether she was being too harsh, whether exposing her family this way was cruel. But seeing that girl erased her hesitation. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about truth for every child who had been bent into shapes they were never meant to hold. For every young woman taught that love must be earned with silence and obedience. If exposing the Whitmores destroyed their reputation, so be it. They had built that reputation on lies. When it was her turn to speak, Ella rose slowly, every movement deliberate. She looked out at the cameras, the rows of faces, and then directly into the lens of the nearest camera. For years she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. My parents taught me that appearances are everything, that we must smile for the cameras, bow to wealth, and silence ourselves for respectability. But appearances are not truth. Today, truth speaks louder than their lies. They may have taught me shame, but I will not carry it anymore. It belongs to them. The room erupted in a storm of flashbulbs and questions, reporters shouting over one another to catch her reaction, her words. But Ella stood still, unshaken, her face calm. Behind her, the words, "The faux philanthropists," glared on the screen like a verdict carved in stone. Luke placed a hand on her back as they stepped away from the podium, his quiet support grounding her in the chaos. The press conference surged forward, reporters swarming the investigative team for more details. The seed had been planted, and Ella knew the story would spread like wildfire. By evening, headlines would scream across the country. By tomorrow, her family's empire would be in freefall. But as she and Luke walked down the steps into the brisk air outside, Ella felt the weight of what she had unleashed settle heavily on her shoulders. She had chosen exposure over forgiveness, truth over silence, and the consequences she knew would be catastrophic for her family. What she did not yet realize was just how fast the storm would hit, or how completely it would bring the Whitmore's tower crashing down. The storm that Ella had unleashed swept through her family's life with devastating force. Within days of the press conference, their once pristine reputation crumbled under the weight of headlines and televised reports. The words, "the faux philanthropists," were repeated endlessly on news channels, social media feeds, and whispered conversations in the circles her parents once dominated. Invitations to galas and boardrooms evaporated. Their names were scrubbed from donor walls at universities, their once-esteemed foundation frozen as investigators poured through every dollar that had ever passed through it. The Whitmore mansion, a monument of stone and pride that had loomed over their community for decades, became a symbol of ruin. Federal authorities arrived in sleek black cars, walking through its marble halls and seizing assets. Furniture was inventoried, artwork taken down from the walls, bank accounts locked tight. What had once been the family's sanctuary turned into a crime scene of silence, where every chandelier and gilded mirror whispered of a grandeur that was never real. The neighbors who once envied the family's stature now watched from behind curtains, murmuring with a mix of pity and satisfaction. Ella did not go to the house, not until her mother begged her to meet. The call had come late at night, her mother's voice strained ragged, stripped of its usual commanding tone. Luke offered to go with her, but Ella insisted she face it alone. When she walked into the parlor where she had once been scolded for sitting improperly, she saw her mother collapsed into an armchair, her once impeccable hair disheveled, her pearls absent. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembling as she reached out. "Ella," she whispered, "please. We can fix this. You're successful now. Powerful even. You could help us. You could save us." For a fleeting moment, Ella saw not the matriarch who had dictated her life, but an aging woman terrified of losing everything. But the plea was not for reconciliation. It was for survival, for preservation of the mask they had worn so long. Ella's jaw tightened as she shook her head. "You're asking for forgiveness without truth. You don't want to change. You just want the world to believe the lie again." Her mother's hand dropped, her sobs echoing in the cold room. Then her father entered, his face red with anger rather than shame. He paced the room, his voice booming as though volume could rewrite reality. "This is not our fault," he barked. "This is the world's fault. The media, the vultures, they tear down anyone who dares to succeed. We gave our lives to appearances, and this is how they repay us. Ruthless, heartless. It's the world that's cruel. Ella, not us." She stared at him incredulous, and then something inside her snapped into clarity. He had always believed love was conditional, tethered to achievement and perfection. It had been his doctrine drilled into her since childhood. Ella rose from her chair, her voice steady but edged with steel. "No, Father. You taught me that only winners are worth love. That's the only truth you ever gave me. And now you've lost, so you've lost everything." The silence that followed was heavy, her words hanging in the air like a verdict neither of them could overturn. Her father turned away, muttering under his breath, but her mother's sobs deepened a sound not of remorse, but of despair at her crumbling empire. Ella felt no triumph, only a weary release, as she turned and walked out of the house for the last time. The fallout spread quickly beyond the mansion's walls. Business partners severed ties overnight, their investments frozen. Properties once held as symbols of wealth were seized, auction notices plastered on gates that had guarded privilege for generations. The family's name, once spoken with reverence, was now muttered with disgust. Socialite friends who had once hung on every invitation now refused to answer calls. Ella watched it unfold from afar, not with glee, but with a grim acceptance. She had not wanted to destroy her family, only to free herself from them. Yet the truth had been too sharp, too bright, to spare them from collapse. Luke stood beside her through it all, reminding her that exposure was not cruelty, but justice. And still at night, when the noise of the world quieted, she sometimes thought of the house where she had grown up, now emptied of its illusions, and felt a flicker of sorrow for what could never be repaired. But as she turned her gaze forward, she could not ignore the new shadow rising behind her. For while her parents retreated into disgrace, Sophie remained unbowed. Her sister, who had once sneered from the safety of her pedestal, was not finished. Behind the scenes, Sophie was already stirring, fueled by bitterness and envy, plotting a retaliation not against the system that condemned them, but against Ella herself. And the weapon she prepared to wield would be as vile as it was personal. The collapse of the Whitmore family had shaken Sophie more than she could bear. Once the darling of high society, she found herself shunned. Her name whispered with disdain at the same parties where she had once been celebrated. The scandal had stolen her power. Her marriage had evaporated in humiliation, and in her eyes the blame belonged not to her parents or to herself, but to Ella. It festered inside her, a venom that grew more bitter with each headline calling Ella courageous, each interview painting her sister as resilient and noble. She began to plot her desperation, driving her toward the ugliest corners of deceit. Late at night, she sat hunched over her laptop, pulling together clips, photos, and old recordings. Piece by piece, she stitched them into a grotesque fabrication. In the video, Ella appeared to be saying things she had never spoken, twisted to look like confessions of greed and manipulation. With careful editing, Sophie made it seem as though Ella had masterminded her parents' exposure, not out of truth, but out of hunger for money and revenge. It was crude in some places, but Sophie believed it was enough to poison the public against her sister. She uploaded the video anonymously, pushing it through shadowy accounts and online forums, confident that scandal would spread quickly once the seed was planted. But Sophie underestimated the watchful eyes surrounding Ella now. Luke, aware of the depths to which Sophie might sink, had tightened security around their lives, not only physical guards, but a digital team monitoring threats and attempts at sabotage. Within hours of the video surfacing, Luke's team had traced the upload to its source. The confrontation came swiftly. Sophie sat in a cafe sipping coffee with shaking hands when two members of Luke's security team approached her table. Calm, professional, but unyielding, they placed a folder in front of her. Inside were printouts of her login records, her email exchanges with a contact who had helped her distribute the video, and even footage from a nearby security camera capturing her in the act of pressing the final upload button. Sophie's face drained of color. She sputtered denials, but the evidence was airtight. She was caught not just by suspicion, but by her own fingerprints across every digital trail. The news of her scheme broke quickly, and this time there was no twisting the story to her advantage. Ella did not need to lift a finger. The facts spoke for themselves. The video was revealed as a malicious fake, a deliberate attempt at defamation. Lawsuits followed swiftly. Luke's legal team filed charges for libel and defamation of character, and the courts moved with unusual speed, propelled by the clarity of the evidence. Sophie, once poised to inherit influence and power, now found herself staring down the reality of fines, lawsuits, and the possibility of jail time. The professional world she had once navigated so effortlessly shut its doors on her. She lost her position in the charitable circles she had clung to, every opportunity evaporating under the shadow of her disgrace. Former friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be tainted by her downfall. For the first time, Sophie experienced what it meant to be powerless, her schemes collapsing under their own weight. Ella, for her part, watched from a distance. There was no triumph in seeing her sister exposed yet again. The sadness she felt was complicated, tangled with old memories of shared childhood rooms, whispered secrets, and the rivalry that had defined their lives. But she did not waver. Sophie had chosen betrayal not once but repeatedly, and every time she had chosen cruelty over kinship. There could be no reconciliation, not anymore. When the verdict came down in court, Sophie sat rigid, her eyes glassy as the judge declared her guilty of defamation. She would pay damages, lose what little financial stability she had left, and carry a criminal record that barred her from rebuilding her old life. The sentence was not long, but it was enough to mark the end of her influence. Sophie left the courtroom, not in triumph, but in silence, the flash of cameras capturing her shame as reporters hurled questions she refused to answer. Back at the farmhouse, Ella stood with Luke, the two of them, watching the coverage on a muted television. Luke reached for her hand, his thumb brushing gently against hers. "It's over," he said quietly. But Ella shook her head. "No. For her, maybe. For me, it's something else entirely." She turned away from the screen, gazing out at the wide fields stretching into the horizon. "It's time to stop fighting what I've lost. It's time to build something new." Her words carried no bitterness, only a steady conviction. Sophie's betrayal had been the final thread tying Ella to the toxic patterns of her past. With it cut, she felt the space to create a future not defined by survival or revenge, but by love, purpose, and chosen family. The wreckage of what had been was undeniable, but from those ashes, Ella knew she would begin again. And this time, she would build a family not from bloodlines and obligations, but from loyalty, trust, and love freely given. She did not yet know how or who would join her, but she knew one thing with certainty: the family that had tried to break her would no longer define her story. A new chapter was waiting, and Ella was ready to write it. The weeks following Sophie's downfall carried a stillness Ella had never known before. For the first time in years, there were no battles to fight, no schemes to unravel, no headlines to brace for. The farmhouse filled with a quiet kind of peace, the kind that came in the sound of wind through the fields and the steady rhythm of Luke's footsteps across the wooden floors. Yet even in this calm, Ella sensed something missing, a piece of herself still searching for belonging. She had severed ties with the family that had rejected her, but the emptiness they left behind remained. That emptiness began to change the day she met Hope. The girl was small, fragile, even with dark eyes too old for her years. Ella had been visiting a local shelter, curious about the community programs that might benefit from the scholarship fund. She hadn't gone looking for anything more. But when she saw Hope sitting alone at a worn table sketching clumsy flowers on scrap paper, her breath caught. It wasn't just the drawing that struck her, it was the way the girl's shoulders hunched as if she expected the world to take her paper away at any moment. Ella recognized that posture instantly. It was her own decades earlier. She knelt beside Hope, asking softly what she was drawing. The girl looked up cautious and whispered, "A garden. Somewhere safe." The words pierced Ella's heart. In that moment she knew. It wasn't pity that gripped her, but recognition. She had found someone who needed the same thing she had once longed for, a place where love wasn't conditional, where family meant protection instead of performance. Within months after patient visits and careful steps through the adoption process, Hope came to live at the farmhouse. The change in Ella was profound. Her days filled with new rhythms, packing lunches, helping with homework, finding joy in the simple questions Hope asked as they walked the fields together. At night, she would watch the girl sleep, her chest rising and falling in the steady calm of safety, and Ella felt a fierce tenderness she had never known. Hope wasn't a replacement for what Ella had lost, but a reminder that family could be chosen and that love was not limited by blood. At the same time, Rachel's place in Ella's life deepened. Having been the first to bring forward the evidence of the Whitmores' corruption, Rachel had proven her loyalty not just with words, but with courage. Ella recognized her cousin's resilience and offered her more than gratitude, she offered her responsibility. Appointing Rachel as director of the scholarship fund was not only a reward, but an affirmation. Together they shaped the program into something remarkable, building bridges between young women and opportunities that had once been barred. In meetings, Ella often watched Rachel with quiet pride, marveling at how the girl once overlooked at family dinners had blossomed into a leader. To Ella, Rachel had become more than a cousin. She was the sister she had always needed, the kind who stood not in rivalry but in solidarity. One evening, after a long day spent reviewing applications for the scholarship, Ella sat on the porch with Luke, the dusk painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. Hope played in the yard, her laughter carrying across the field as she chased fireflies. Rachel had just left after dinner, promising to return the next morning with new ideas for outreach. Ella leaned into Luke's shoulder, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't triumph, though victory had been hard won. It wasn't even relief, though peace was precious. It was fullness, the feeling of belonging at last. Luke, sensing her quiet reflection, spoke softly. "You didn't lose a family," he said, his voice steady and certain. "You built one." Tears welled in Ella's eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. He was right. The people who had tried to define her worth had failed. But in their failure, she had discovered something stronger. With Luke, with Hope, with Rachel, she had created a family grounded not in status or control, but in love, freely given and fiercely protected. It was not the family of her birth, but the family of her choosing. As the stars began to appear above the fields, Ella felt for the first time that her story was no longer about surviving what had been done to her, but about shaping what would come after. She smiled as Hope ran up the porch steps, holding out her cupped hands to reveal a single glowing firefly. Ella laughed, brushing her daughter's hair back from her face, and thought, this is what it means to be home. But peace, however cherished, is never without interruption. The following morning, as Ella sifted through mail at the kitchen table, her fingers froze on an envelope bearing handwriting she knew too well. The script was sharp, deliberate, the same that had signed countless rules and decrees in her childhood. Her father's handwriting. The paper trembled slightly in her grasp as she slid the letter free. Inside a single page waited the words poised to pierce through the fragile calm she had built. Whatever lay written there would not be casual. It would be a test, one final tug on the threads of her heart. And Ella, staring at the folded page, braced herself for the weight of the past to try once more to claim her future. Ella sat at the kitchen table, the envelope still heavy in her hands. Hope was outside, chasing the dog through the tall grass, her laughter carrying through the open window, while Luke worked in the barn, his voice drifting faintly as he hummed a tune. The farmhouse was filled with life, but the letter in her grip pulled her back into shadows she had fought so hard to escape. She unfolded the page slowly, her father's familiar handwriting slanting across the paper with precision, each line a weapon dressed as reason. The letter wasted no time in revealing its venom. Her father did not write of remorse or reflection, only recrimination. He accused her of destroying the family, of bringing shame on their name, of tearing apart the legacy they had worked so hard to build. Every sentence was a reminder of the control he still sought to wield. "You have turned against us," the letter read, "and the world now believes lies because of you. A true daughter would have protected her family, no matter the cost. You betrayed us, and for that we have lost everything." Ella felt her stomach twist, but not with doubt. For years, words like these had bent her into silence, but now they rang hollow. She read on each line, more cutting than the last. He wrote that she owed them her success, that without their guidance she would have been nothing. He insisted that one day she would regret choosing the farmer over the family, that her new life was built on rebellion, not strength. The letter closed with a demand, not a plea. "You will carry this guilt forever because you made us fall." When she finished, her hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of final clarity. There was no love here, no recognition, no willingness to see her as anything more than a pawn that had slipped from their grasp. Her father had not changed. He would never change. The letter was not a bridge to reconciliation, but a chain, one last attempt to bind her to a past steeped in control and disdain. Ella set the paper down, staring at it as anger and grief tangled within her chest. Then slowly she reached for a clean sheet and began to write. Her pen moved with a steadiness she hadn't expected, each word pouring out with certainty. "You wanted a daughter to obey." She began, her handwriting sharp, unyielding. "You raised one who would rise. You taught me to smile while you crushed my voice to perform, while you dismissed my dreams. You thought love was a prize for perfection. But love, real love, is not something you earn by bowing. I will not bow to you anymore." Her words gained strength with every line. She wrote of the family she had chosen, of the life she was building, of the truth she no longer feared. She wrote not to change him, but to claim herself. "You cannot take my peace, and you cannot take my worth. I am not your failure. I am my own victory." When she finished, she signed her name with a flourish that felt like a seal of finality. She folded the letter once, then, without hesitation, carried it outside to the fire pit, where they burned brush and scraps. The evening air was cool, the sky painted in fading gold as the sun slipped low. She placed her father's letter atop the grate, then set her own response on top of it. With a single match, she touched flame to paper. The fire caught quickly, curling the edges, blackening the ink until the words disappeared into smoke. She stood watching until nothing remained but ash, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of grief and relief. Luke joined her quietly, his hand brushing against hers, his presence grounding her. Hope's laughter still rang from the fields, unbroken and pure. Ella turned toward them, away from the fire, knowing she had finally severed the last tie that bound her to a life of shame. The past no longer owned her. Its voice had been silenced in the crackle of burning paper, its grip dissolved into smoke, drifting harmlessly into the sky. She drew in a deep breath, tasting freedom in the cool evening air. For the first time, she felt entirely her own, unshadowed by obligation or guilt. The letter had been her father's final attempt to claim her, and by destroying it, she had claimed herself instead. As she walked back toward the farmhouse, Luke's arm around her shoulders and Hope running ahead with a trail of fireflies in her wake, Ella felt a quiet anticipation stirring within her. The field stretched wide, heavy with promise. Harvest season was near, and this year it would mean more than crops and yield. It would mark the true beginning of the life she had chosen, a season of reaping what she had sown not just in the soil, but in the freedom she had fought so hard to earn. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of ripe grain and the faint sweetness of wildflowers at the edges of the field. The Montana sky stretched endlessly, a blue canvas streaked with gold, as the sun rose bathing the land in a warm glow. Ella stood with Luke at the edge of their fields, the stalks of wheat swaying gently, their heads bowed heavy with promise. It was harvest season, the culmination of months of work, but for Ella, it felt like more than a season of crops. It was a season of proof of renewal, of finding meaning in soil that had once seemed a cage, but had become her salvation. Luke's hand rested on her shoulder, grounding her as always. She looked at him and saw not just the man who had pulled her from the suffocating expectations of her past, but the man who had built a life with her row by row, seed by seed. Together, they had faced storms, losses, the sneers of her family, and the burden of her own doubts. Now they stood surrounded by abundance, not just in the field, but in the love that had grown between them, tested and strengthened by every trial. Ella breathed in deeply, the sight of the golden fields filling her chest with something she hadn't realized. She craved peace. For so long she had fought against shadows, against her family's cruelty, against her own fear of being small, against the lie that worth was measured only in status. Now, as the sun glinted off the harvest, she understood that what stretched before her wasn't just land or wealth. It was freedom. Every stalk represented resilience. Every acre was a page rewritten in her story. She was no longer the daughter who bowed, nor the wife mocked as barn wife. She was Ella reborn from the soil they had dismissed as worthless. As the combines rumbled to life in the distance, Hope came running through the rows, her small hands brushing against the grain. Her laughter rose above the machinery, pure and clear, a sound Ella cherished more than any applause she had once craved in New York. Rachel followed, clipboard in hand, already making notes for the scholarship fund that was changing lives across the country. This was Ella's real family, her real legacy built not from marble floors and empty titles, but from earth and heart. Luke squeezed her hand and said quietly, "Look at what we've made." His voice held pride, but not the pride of ownership. It was the pride of survival, of partnership, of choosing each other when the world had told them they would fail. Ella turned toward him and saw his smile against the backdrop of the fields, and it struck her how love, once a battlefield, now felt like the safest place in the world. She remembered the nights she had stood alone, wondering if she had made the wrong choice, wondering if exile from her family meant a lifetime of regret. But regret was nowhere in sight now. In its place was clarity. The soil that stained her hands was not a mark of shame, but of strength. The farmhouse that smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread was more of a home than her family's mansion had ever been. She realized she had not just survived her family's rejection, she had outgrown it. The harvest stretched into the evening machines, moving rhythmically across the land as the light turned amber, then crimson. Ella stood with Luke and Hope watching the last of the wheat being collected. She felt tears prick her eyes, not from sorrow but from gratitude. The journey had been brutal at times, but it had led her here to this moment where she could finally say she had found the light beyond the darkness. As the stars began to emerge, Ella sat on the porch with Luke, their hands intertwined. Hope fell asleep in her lap, a bundle of trust and promise. The hum of the countryside surrounded them, and Ella let the quiet fill her, a quiet that was not emptiness, but fullness. She whispered softly, almost to herself. "We made it. We found the light." Luke kissed her temple in answer, saying nothing because nothing more needed to be said. just when Ella thought her heart was content to remain in this bubble of peace. The phone on the porch table buzzed. Rachel picked it up and walked over, her expression unreadable. "Ella," she said slowly, "you need to hear this. A journalist from a major network wants to feature your story. Not Luke's empire, not the scandal with your family, but your journey. They want the world to hear it." Ella froze, the weight of those words pressing into her. For years her family had tried to silence her, to reduce her to a shadow, to strip her voice away. Now the world was asking her to speak, to step into the light, not as a victim, but as the woman she had become. She looked at Luke, then at Hope, asleep in her arms, then out at the fields glowing faintly under the moonlight. She had found peace here, but perhaps her story was not meant to remain only on this land. Perhaps it was time to let the world know that even from the soil others mocked, something extraordinary could bloom. And as that thought took root, Ella felt the stirrings of a new beginning, one that would carry her voice far beyond the fields of Montana. The scholarship fund was no longer just an idea scribbled on Luke's desk, or a dream murmured between Ella and him under the stars. It had become a living, breathing legacy, carrying the name of Luke's late mother and spreading hope across the country. Dozens of young women who might never have set foot in a university classroom were now enrolled, their futures crackling with possibility. Ella watched them gather for the first annual scholarship banquet, their faces bright with nervous excitement, their voices carrying that mix of fear and determination she remembered so well in herself. One girl stood out that evening. Her name was Clara, a shy 19-year-old from Kansas who clutched her speech in trembling hands. When she walked up to the podium, her eyes sought Ella's across the room, as though drawing courage from her presence. Clara's voice wavered at first, but soon steadied as she told her story. She spoke of being raised in a household that silenced her dreams, of being told she was destined only to marry well, of being discouraged every time she wanted to pursue her studies. Then she said, "I thought my life was already written for me, but this scholarship has given me the pen to write it myself." The room erupted in applause, but Ella felt tears sting her eyes because Clara's words were echoes of her own life. In that moment, Ella understood that the fund was more than charity. It was a mirror reflecting her past and a bridge carrying others toward a different future. After the banquet, requests poured in for interviews. Journalists wanted to know more about the woman behind the fund, the one who had been quietly reshaping opportunities for young women in agriculture and beyond. Ella hesitated at first. Her instinct had always been to protect the privacy she and Luke had built. But Rachel reminded her gently, "Your story isn't just yours anymore. It belongs to the women who will follow because of it." So Ella agreed, and 1 week later she found herself seated in front of bright studio lights. A camera pointed at her. Her name splashed across the screen, Ella Reynolds, from rejection to renewal. The interviewer leaned forward, asking her to share the journey that had led her from the glittering but hollow world of New York society to the fields of Montana, from shame and exile to building something lasting. At first, Ella's voice was soft, cautious. She spoke of leaving behind comfort, of being mocked for marrying a farmer, of being cast aside by those who should have loved her unconditionally. But as she continued, her voice grew stronger, threaded with conviction. She told of discovering the worth of soil and sweat, of the peace that came from planting seeds with her own hands, of finding a family not through blood, but through choice and love. And then she spoke of the scholarship fund, of Clara and the other young women who were now daring to step into futures once denied them. By the time the interview ended, Ella sensed the studio had shifted. The cameraman, the producer, even the makeup artist who had hovered nervously at the edge of the set, all looked at her with quiet admiration. The episode aired the following week, and within days, letters, emails, and messages flooded in from across the country. Women who had felt silenced wrote to thank her for giving them hope. Mothers wrote about showing the interview to their daughters. Men wrote about rethinking what it meant to measure worth. Ella realized she had become something she never intended, a voice for countless others. One evening, as she read through a stack of handwritten letters, Luke came up behind her and rested his chin on her shoulder. "They see what I've always seen," he whispered. Ella smiled, but her heart swelled not with pride but with humility. She had not set out to inspire anyone, she had only sought to survive. Yet survival had turned into a story, and that story was now rippling outward in ways she could not have imagined. Weeks later, Ella sat once more in the fields as harvest gave way to winter's hush. Hope chased the dog in the yard, Rachel finalized reports for the fund, and Luke leaned against a fence, his eyes following Ella as if to remind her she was still the center of his world. Ella thought her life might finally settle into this rhythm of peace, purpose, and love. But life she knew by now never stayed still for long. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at it absent-mindedly, expecting another thank you note or an update from the scholarship committee. Instead, she froze as she read the message. It was from a prestigious cultural foundation based in New York City, inviting her to speak at a national conference on women resilience and legacy. They wanted her on the stage where her parents' world still lingered, the city she had left in disgrace. Ella set the phone down, her pulse quickening. The thought of returning to New York, to the place where her family's betrayal still echoed in every corner, made her chest tighten. Yet the invitation also carried a promise. This time she would not walk into that city as a woman begging for approval. She would return as someone who had built her own name, her own legacy. She looked out at the fields, golden even in fading light, and whispered to herself, maybe it's time. But whether it was a step toward healing or a new battlefield waiting to be faced, she could not yet know. The only certainty was that New York was calling her back, and she would have to answer. The train pulled into Penn Station under the familiar roar of New York's chaos, and Ella felt a strange mixture of nerves and certainty as she stepped onto the platform. Years ago, she had left this city with rain running down her face and her family's scorn ringing in her ears. Now she was back by invitation, her name printed on banners across the city keynote speaker, Ella Reynolds. The city that once seemed to spit her out now welcomed her on its grandest stage, not as a cast-off, but as a voice of strength. The conference hall shimmered with modern elegance, filled with designers, architects, and cultural leaders from across the country. It was the very circle Ella's family had once prized above all else, the circle they had used to measure worth. She had dreaded this moment when the invitation first arrived, but as she walked through the tall glass doors, she realized she was not the same woman who had once tried desperately to fit in. She wore a simple but striking gown, her hair pulled back, her confidence flowing not from diamonds or approval, but from the life she had built brick by brick on Montana soil. Backstage organizers fussed nervously, rehearsing the program with anxious whispers, but Ella barely heard them. She stood at the edge of the curtain, listening to the hum of the crowd. There was no trace of her parents' presence here, no whispers of their name, no glances toward their influence. Their downfall was complete, their legacy, nothing but ashes, and the city had moved on without them. For Ella, the absence was not bitter. It was liberating. When her name was announced, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Ella stepped into the light, her heels striking the stage floor with steady rhythm. The applause was polite at first, the kind given to any keynote speaker, but when she began to speak, the room stilled into silence. She did not deliver a lecture about design trends or industry insights. Instead, she told her story. She spoke of designing rooms that looked perfect but felt empty, of living under expectations that had no space for her soul. She told them of the ridicule she had endured for loving a man who worked the land, of being cast out and called names that cut to her bones. And then she told them of the farm of the soil under her nails, of finding meaning in sunsets and in rebuilding not just a home but herself. Her words were not dramatic, but they were true, and truth carried more weight than any grand performance. She described how she learned that design wasn't about perfection or prestige. It was about creating spaces that held love and authenticity. The scholarship fund, the work with young women, the community she had built with Luke and Rachel, all of it flowed into her speech like pieces of a mosaic. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Then slowly, people rose to their feet. The applause began as a ripple and swelled into thunder. They were not clapping for a pedigree or a family name. They were clapping for her. For Ella, who had risen from the soil they had once mocked. She stood tall, letting the applause wash over her, not as validation, but as acknowledgement. She had needed no one's permission to arrive here, and she needed no one's approval to remain. As she left the stage, Ella's chest was full, not with pride alone, but with the quiet joy of being seen for who she truly was. Backstage, a line of attendees waited to greet her, each eager to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her how her story had touched them. Ella smiled, her gratitude genuine, but her heart was already leaning toward home, toward Luke and Hope, and the fields where her truest self resided. Yet just as she began to slip toward the quiet of the green room, a familiar figure appeared in the crowd waiting near the back entrance. Her breath caught. It was her mother. Not the woman dressed in sharp gowns with diamonds flashing at every wrist, but a smaller, almost frailer version. She wore no jewels, no air of dominance. Her eyes were fixed on Ella, a mixture of longing and uncertainty flickering in them. The sight jolted Ella. After all the fires she had walked through, after burning her father's letter, after severing herself from their world, here was the past in flesh and blood. Her mother's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Ella's heart pounded. She had been applauded by strangers, but now she faced something harder, the silent question of whether she could offer grace to the woman who had once stood by while her daughter was broken. The crowd around them blurred. The applause still echoed faintly from the hall. And Ella found herself standing at the edge of a new decision, one that would test not her strength, but her mercy. The conference hall had quieted after Ella's keynote, the applause still lingering in the corners like a soft echo. She stood near the edge of the stage, letting the energy of the crowd wash over her when a familiar figure appeared in the back. Her mother, smaller than Ella remembered, dressed plainly, yet her presence carried the same weight of authority she always had. The woman's eyes locked onto Ella's, a mixture of hope and unspoken demands that made Ella's chest tighten. Without waiting for introductions, she asked to see Hope. Her voice soft, but carrying the undercurrent of control she had wielded for so long. Ella felt a cold flicker of anger at first, memories of years of manipulation and dismissal rising up like a tide. But then she looked at Hope, who was quietly drawing in her notebook beside Rachel, unaware of the tension coiling in the room. Ella's protective instincts kicked in, and she realized that allowing this meeting might benefit Hope, giving her a glimpse of her maternal lineage without letting the toxic patterns repeat. She nodded once firmly and gestured for her mother to follow her to a quieter side of the hall. Hope's eyes lit up with curiosity as her grandmother approached. Ella stayed close but maintained a respectful distance, a subtle shield between them. Her mother's voice softened, shifting to coaxing tones, asking questions about the girl's life, her studies, and her dreams. She offered praise that sounded sincere, though Ella could detect the undercurrent of manipulation, the way her words were designed to pull at Hope's emotions, and through her to reach Ella. Hope, for her part, was polite and curious, responding cautiously, unaware of the subtle tension in the room. Ella watched the exchange, her mind running through the years of control and belittlement she had endured. The same tactics her mother used now on Hope had been aimed at her for decades, every smile a calculation, every compliment a measure of obedience. She felt a pang, a recognition of the patterns that had shaped her childhood, yet she did not let it sway her judgment. She stepped forward when the conversation paused and spoke softly to Hope, reminding her of the importance of making her own choices and speaking her own truth. Her mother nodded, the briefest shadow of recognition crossing her face, as though she understood that Ella's control of the encounter was absolute. Ella realized then that she was exercising a new kind of power, one not of dominance, but of protection. She could allow a connection, a brief interaction, without surrendering herself or her daughter to the cycles of manipulation that had defined her past. The meeting ended with Hope giving a shy smile to her grandmother and retreating back to Ella's side. Ella's mother lingered a moment as though wishing to extend the contact, but Ella's quiet authority was unmistakable. The past would not repeat here. She maintained a gentle but firm boundary, allowing the encounter to exist solely for Hope's sake, not for hers, not for her mother's. As they walked back to the main conference area, Ella felt a strange release, a quiet affirmation that forgiveness and reconciliation were not synonymous. She could release the burden of anger and hurt without reopening herself to exploitation or emotional manipulation. She had set the terms, and in doing so, she discovered the essence of grace, the ability to choose freedom over resentment, clarity over chaos. Later, in the stillness of the evening, Ella sat at her desk with her journal open. She began to write, tracing the path from her earliest memories of control and rejection through the journey that had brought her to this point, Montana Luke, Hope, and the Scholarship Fund. Each sentence was a reflection, a crystallization of lessons learned and victories hard won. She wrote not for the applause or validation of others, but to solidify her understanding, to ensure that her story could serve as a guide for those who might one day face the same suffocating pressures of family expectations and societal judgment. With each word, she felt the tension of the day dissolve. The encounter with her mother had tested her, reminded her of the shadows of her past. Yet it had also reaffirmed her agency and her boundaries. She realized that the act of recording her journey was itself an act of liberation, transforming personal trials into lessons for others. She continued to write long into the night, the quiet scratch of pen on paper, a melody of resilience, determination, and hope. By the time she set down her pen, Ella knew with certainty that her story would reach beyond the walls of the conference, beyond the farm, beyond her immediate life. It would inspire, instruct, and empower others. She had chosen not only to survive her past, but to turn it into a beacon, a testament to the strength that comes from owning one's journey and building a life on one's own terms. The inked pages lay before her, a promise of influence and guidance, ready to touch the lives of those who, like her, sought light beyond the shadows. Ella sat at her writing desk, the late afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows of the farmhouse, casting long shadows across the pages of her manuscript. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of wooden floors and the distant call of birds settling in for the evening. After years of turmoil, of rebuilding, and of creating a life on her own terms, she now had the space to reflect on everything that had brought her here. She opened her laptop and stared at the blank screen for a moment before typing the title at the top, From Dirt to Dynasty. The words felt weighty but fitting, a bridge between the soil she had come to love and the empire she had built, not one of power over others, but of hope, integrity, and resilience. As she began to write, Ella traced the story of her past, the years she had spent under the crushing expectations of a family who valued status above love, who mocked her choices and attempted to manipulate every decision she made. She recalled the sharp sting of ridicule, the letters that had tried to bind her with guilt, the whispers that had followed her in every room of the New York penthouses she once designed. She described her decision to leave it all behind, to step into Montana with Luke, to face the unknown, with nothing but courage and love to guide her. The words poured freely, filled with both pain and triumph, honesty and reflection. She wrote about Luke, the steady presence who had never asked her to change for him, who had shown her the true meaning of partnership. She wrote about Hope, the little girl who had taught her that family was not inherited but chosen, and Rachel, whose loyalty had proven that love and support could be found beyond the confines of blood. Each sentence was a testament to survival, to the lessons she had carved from adversity. Ella realized as she typed that her story was not a recounting of vengeance but a chronicle of healing. Success had never been about proving her family wrong. It had been about proving to herself that she could remain whole despite their attempts to diminish her. She detailed the creation of the Scholarship Fund, the lives it touched, the opportunities it provided to girls like Clara, who would otherwise never have been given a voice. Her triumphs in New York, her keynote speeches, and the attention she received from national media were not accolades for besting her family. They were milestones in a life rebuilt, a life that refused to be broken. Luke walked quietly into the room, his presence a grounding force as he leaned against the doorway. He had been observing her, watching as the words flowed across the screen, and he spoke softly, almost reverently. "You've built something extraordinary, Ella. Not because of them, but because of you." She looked up at him and smiled, exhaustion and pride mingling in her expression. He stepped closer, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "We didn't win," he said, his voice steady and sure. "We healed." The words resonated through her chest, not as a declaration of conquest, but as a truth she had come to understand only through the trials she had endured. Ella nodded, letting herself feel the full weight of what they had achieved together. They had walked through fire and come out not just unscathed, but strengthened their bond, forged by honesty, love, and shared purpose. The empire they had built was not one of intimidation or control, but of opportunity, compassion, and resilience. Each chapter she wrote was another brick laid in a foundation of integrity, ensuring that her story would serve as both record and guide for those who might follow. As the sun dipped lower, bathing the room in warm amber light, Ella paused and looked out the window toward the fields beyond. The wheat swayed gently in the evening breeze, a living reminder of the life she had nurtured from the ground up. She realized that the greatest lessons she had learned were not found in courtrooms or conferences, not in recognition from strangers, or the collapse of her family's empire, but in the quiet moments of everyday life, planting seeds with her own hands, watching Hope laugh, and sharing a meal with Luke at the end of a long day. The victories she understood were not in proving others wrong, they were in proving to herself that she could live fully, freely, and lovingly, despite all she had endured. She leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a moment of contentment. She understood now that healing was ongoing, a practice as much as an achievement. Forgiveness was not for those who had hurt her, it was for her to release the lingering shadows of the past and make room for new light. She imagined the faces of the girls whose lives would be changed by her scholarship fund, the letters of gratitude, the future they would carve for themselves. That vision filled her with a quiet joy, a sense of purpose that was deeper and more enduring than any fleeting triumph. Ella reached for a cup of tea, setting it beside her laptop, and watched as the first stars began to twinkle over the fields. She felt the stillness settle around her, the rhythm of the land and the life she had chosen, harmonizing into a profound sense of belonging. There was no need for applause, no need for validation beyond the soft, unwavering love of those who had stood beside her. She had survived, she had built, and she had healed. As she closed her laptop and stepped toward the porch, Luke at her side and Hope skipping ahead into the twilight, Ella took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill her lungs. It was in these quiet, ordinary moments that the meaning of her journey crystallized. The triumphs and trials, the betrayals and victories, the heartbreak and resilience, all converged into a simple truth. Life's deepest significance often resides not in grandeur or spectacle, but in the ordinary, in the peace of standing firmly in your own power, and in the ability to nurture love and growth from what was once barren. She smiled, feeling the earth beneath her feet, the wind in her hair, and the steady presence of her family she had chosen. This day, like so many that would follow, held a meaning richer than she could have imagined, a quiet testament to the life she had fought to claim. The morning sun spilled golden light across the Montana plains, brushing the fields in a warm glow that made every stalk of wheat shimmer like liquid gold. Ella, Luke, and Hope walked side by side along the winding dirt paths of their farm, the air crisp and filled with the faint scent of freshly turned soil. Hope's laughter trilled as she darted ahead, chasing a rabbit that had dared to peek from the edge of the cornfield, her small hands reaching out as though to touch the horizon itself. Ella watched her, her heart swelling with a serenity she had never known in the bustling streets and glittering facades of New York. Here there was no judgment, no expectations, no shadows from a family that had once sought to control her every step. Ella's boots pressed softly against the earth, and she let herself sink into the rhythm of the land, feeling the subtle undulations of the fields beneath her. Luke's hand brushed against hers, warm and steady, grounding her in the reality that this peace was hard-won, carved from years of struggle, resilience, and unwavering determination. They moved together through rows of wheat that glowed in the sunlight, the golden grains whispering in the breeze. each stalk a testament to the labor and love poured into this land. This was more than a farm. It was a sanctuary, a living symbol of the life they had built together, rooted in honesty, in patience, in mutual respect, and in a commitment to nurturing growth not just from soil, but from one another. Ella inhaled deeply, tasting the crisp air, and whispered almost to herself, "This is what they never gave me, peace." The words floated in the warm wind, soft but resolute, carrying with them the weight of a lifetime spent in pursuit of validation she had never received from those who should have loved her unconditionally. She looked at Luke, whose eyes met hers with an understanding that required no explanation. He smiled gently and replied, "They never could." The simplicity of his words, grounded in truth, and the absence of pretense made Ella's chest swell with gratitude. For the first time in decades, she felt that she had truly arrived somewhere she could belong, somewhere the past held no sway, and where love was given freely, not as a condition to meet. Hope ran ahead, weaving through the field with the unbridled joy of a child unburdened by expectations. Ella watched the sunlight catch her hair, turning each strand into a flame of gold, and she realized that this innocence, this freedom, was the true inheritance she had sought all along. The laughter, the gentle conversation with Luke, the simple cadence of their steps over the dirt paths, it all created a rhythm of life she had longed for, one defined not by status or approval, but by authenticity and love. Each moment here was a quiet triumph, a reclamation of self and spirit from the years of being silenced, controlled, and underestimated. They reached the edge of the property where the barn stood, its red paint slightly faded but sturdy, and Ella ran her fingers along the rough wooden siding. Memories of hardship and loss flickered in her mind, the ridicule, the letters, the betrayals. But here they seemed distant, almost unreal. The land had become a healer, the labor a meditation, and the people around her a mirror reflecting the truth that strength was not measured by how high one could climb in the world, but by how deeply one could root oneself in love and purpose. Luke stood close, his arm brushing hers, and she realized that this shared life was the culmination of every choice she had made to reject toxicity, to pursue authenticity, and to embrace the kind of freedom only courage could yield. Ella knelt briefly to touch the soil, feeling its cool richness crumble between her fingers. This earth had borne the seeds of their survival and their joy. It had witnessed their pain and their triumphs. She looked up at the horizon where the sun now fully embraced the sky, illuminating the vastness of their farm, and she felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with money, recognition, or titles. It was the triumph of life reclaimed, of a heart healed, and of a family built not by obligation, but by choice. They continued their walk. Ella's hand in Luke's. Hope skipping between them, and the quiet of the land seemed to hum with the promise of what was to come. The fields stretched endlessly, golden and abundant, whispering that there was more to reap than grain alone. It was a harvest of resilience, of love, and of life lived with intention. Ella's mind wandered to the upcoming months, to the work that still lay ahead with the scholarship fund, the projects that would expand their legacy and the lives they could touch. But in this moment, she let herself simply be a mother, a partner, a woman who had finally found a home in the land she loved. As the sun began its descent, casting long, tranquil shadows across the farm, Ella looked at Luke, and together they took in the sight of the fields stretching endlessly before them. The breeze carried the scent of wheat and soil, the sound of Hope's laughter, and the hum of life in its purest form. The day was ordinary in its simplicity, yet extraordinary in its meaning. They had endured storms both literal and figurative, and now they walked in peace. Ella breathed in deeply, letting the moment imprint on her soul. This was what she had fought for, what she had longed for, what she had finally earned. And as she gazed across the land, the first signs of the harvest season's peak came into view. The combines lined up at the distant edge of the field, engines rumbling softly as they prepared to collect the ripest grains yet. Ella smiled, knowing that this would be the largest, most abundant harvest they had ever seen, a fitting close to one chapter and the beginning of another. It was a promise of sustenance growth and the continuation of a legacy built not from wealth or power, but from love, courage, and the land they cherished so deeply. The sun hung low over the Montana plains, casting long golden shadows across the fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was the height of harvest season, the culmination of months of labor care and relentless determination. Every row of wheat shimmered in the fading light, the grains heavy with promise, whispering of abundance earned through sweat and patience. Ella stood at the center of it all, hands resting on the soft soil, breathing in the earthy scent that had become synonymous with freedom, with life, with the story she had chosen to write for herself. Beside her, Luke watched his eyes reflecting pride and quiet wonder. Hope scampered ahead, her laughter ringing through the air as she explored the edge of the fields carrying the irrepressible energy of youth and possibility. Ella knelt and scooped a handful of soil, letting it fall slowly through her fingers, each grain a reminder of the journey that had brought her here, from rejection and ridicule to resilience and triumph. The farm was not just a plot of land. It was a testament to choice, to love, to the reclamation of power she had once thought lost forever. Ella carried a small sapling, its roots carefully wrapped, ready to be planted as a symbol of beginnings anew. She walked to a spot she had chosen near the edge of the field where the golden wheat met the horizon and sank the roots into the earth. She patted the soil gently around it, whispering softly, as if speaking to the life she was nurturing, not just in the plant, but in herself. Each motion was deliberate, reverent, a ritual marking the full circle of a journey that had been marked by heartache, struggle, and ultimately empowerment. As she stood and brushed the dirt from her hands, Ella reflected on who she had been when she first left New York, a woman defined by others' expectations and belittled for her choices. She had been the daughter scorned, the bride mocked as a barn wife, a figure small in the eyes of those who judged her by wealth and status rather than heart and integrity. Yet here she was, now standing firm in her truth, a woman who had chosen her path and built a life on her own terms. She was no longer a victim of circumstance or family judgment. She was the architect of her own destiny. Luke came to her side, taking her hand in his, and they both looked across the expanse of fields, the afternoon sun turning everything to gold. "It's the largest harvest yet," he said softly, his voice carrying both awe and gratitude. Ella nodded, feeling the weight of the words, not just the harvest, but the culmination of every choice, every sacrifice, every moment of resilience that had led them here. The farm was abundant, yes, but more importantly, it was filled with the freedom and fulfillment that had once seemed impossible. Ella turned to look at Hope, who was crouched beside the sapling, patting the earth with small, determined hands. The girl's innocence and courage were reflections of the strength Ella had nurtured in herself, a living reminder that the cycles of life, growth, and healing continued beyond the scars of the past. She realized that her journey was no longer about survival alone. It was about the legacy she was creating, the lessons embedded in soil, sweat, and love that would endure long after she was gone. She knelt beside the sapling again, pressing her palms into the earth, and whispered, "The soil they mocked was the ground on which I grew strong." Those words were not spoken to anyone but herself, yet they carried the resonance of decades of struggle, triumph, and reclamation. They were a declaration, a reminder that power, worth, and fulfillment were not given. They were claimed, cultivated, and protected. As the last rays of sunlight stretched across the horizon, casting a warm glow over the golden fields, Ella looked to Luke and Hope, her chosen family, and felt a profound sense of completeness. The past, with all its pain, rejection, and betrayal, had been transformed into the foundation for growth. And in that moment, she understood that life's greatest victories were not measured in wealth, recognition, or revenge. They were measured in the ability to rise, to nurture, and to flourish on one's own terms. The wind whispered through the wheat, carrying the scent of earth and promise. Ella placed her hands on the small sapling one last time, imagining the years ahead, imagining the life it would nurture, imagining the future it would witness. And she knew that this final harvest, the culmination of their labor and perseverance, was only the beginning. The farm would continue to flourish, the family they had built would grow, and the lessons of courage and resilience would be carried forward in every blade of grass, every grain of wheat, every heartbeat of the land. And from that soil, a new legacy will bloom. And so Ella's journey came full circle, not as the woman her parents once tried to mold, but as the woman she chose to become. From scorn to strength, from being cast aside to standing tall, she built her own legacy on the very soil others mocked. Her story is not just about revenge, but about reclaiming dignity, finding peace, and proving that true worth is measured not by status, but by the life you choose to live. If you've followed her path this far, I invite you to reflect on it with me. What would you have done in Ella's place? Have you ever been underestimated only to rise stronger because of it? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every story matters, and yours could inspire someone else. And if you want more stories like this, full of drama, resilience, and unforgettable twists, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what's coming next. This is only the beginning, and I'd love for you to be part of the journey.